Imagine a 12-year-old girl standing alone in a freezing courthouse hallway at 9 o'clock at night. No parents, no lawyer, no one coming to save her. The state has already stamped her file. In 6 hours, Haven Morelli will officially become a permanent ward of the system, swallowed whole by the same machine that's been chewing her up since she was 4 years old. But tonight, this kid does something no social worker, no judge, no foster parent ever expected. She walks out into the worst November storm this city has seen in 20 years, crosses 8 miles of frozen streets carrying nothing but a soaked backpack and a blank guardianship form, and steps into the garage of the most dangerous motorcycle club in the state. What happens next will wreck you. Stay with me until the very end of this one, because I promise you, this story hits different. Drop a like right now, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, and let's ride. The fluorescent light above Haven Morelli's head had been buzzing for 3 hours. Not the kind of buzzing you stop noticing. The kind that drills into the soft part behind your eyes and stays there, humming against your skull like something alive and angry. She sat on a wooden bench in the second-floor hallway of the Ridgeton County Family Courthouse, feet dangling 6 inches above the floor because she was small for 12 and always had been. Small for 12, small for 10, small for 8. Every foster home noted it in her file like a warning label. Undersized, quiet, does not engage. She didn't engage now either. Rain hammered the windows beside her in sheets so thick the parking lot lights looked like smeared yellow bruises through the glass. November in Ridgeton meant the kind of cold that crawled under your skin and set up camp in your bones, and Haven could feel it seeping through the courthouse walls like the building itself was giving up. Her sneakers were soaked. Her hoodie was soaked. The backpack sitting between her feet had a broken zipper and held everything she owned in this world. A toothbrush missing half its bristles, 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans with a hole in the left knee, a composition notebook filled with handwriting no one had ever read, and a blank Form 27G. Petition for emergency guardianship transfer. She'd stolen the form from the clerk's desk 40 minutes ago while the woman was arguing with someone on the phone about a parking ticket. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed Haven. That was the trick she'd learned somewhere around foster home number 4. If you stayed quiet enough, still enough, if you breathed shallow and kept your eyes on the floor, you became furniture. Furniture doesn't get hit. Furniture doesn't get screamed at. Furniture doesn't get sent back. Furniture also doesn't get saved. Down the hall, behind a door with a frosted glass window, she could hear voices. Her caseworker, Denise Bowman, was in there. Judge's clerk was in there. Somebody from the state's Child Protective Division was in there. They were talking about Haven the way mechanics talk about a car that's not worth fixing anymore. What do we do with it? Where does it go? Whose budget does it come out of? She'd heard that tone before. The tired, flat, slightly annoyed tone of adults who had too many files and not enough patience and absolutely zero interest in pretending this child was anything other than a problem to be processed. Her last foster placement had lasted 11 days. The Gardners. Nice house, 2 dogs. A backyard with a trampoline she never got to use because Mrs. Gardner decided on day 3 that Haven was too withdrawn, and Mr. Gardner decided on day 8 that having a kid who didn't smile was creepy. They called Denise on day 11 and said they couldn't do it. Couldn't do what exactly, Haven never understood. Couldn't sit in the same house as a quiet child. Couldn't tolerate the unbearable burden of a girl who took up almost no space. Before the Gardners, there was the Okafor group home. Before that, the Whelans. Before that, a temporary placement with a single mother named Darla, who drank cooking wine at breakfast and cried every night into a pillow Haven could hear through the wall. Before Darla, the names blurred together, faces blurred, kitchens blurred. The only constant was the backpack and the buzzing lights, and the courthouses and the forms and the caseworkers who never remembered her name on the first try. Haven pulled the blank guardianship form from the backpack and stared at it. Line 14, name of proposed guardian, empty. Line 15, relationship to minor, empty. Line 22, signature of guardian. Affirming willingness to accept legal responsibility, empty. Every line on this form was a question Haven Morelli couldn't answer, and in approximately 5 hours and 40 minutes, Judge Sarah Hawk would arrive for the morning session and sign the order that would transfer Haven permanently into the state's long-term institutional care system. Not a foster home, not a group home, an institution, a facility. The kind of place with locked hallways and scheduled meals and staff who wore lanyards and called you by your case number when they forgot your name, which was always. Haven folded the form carefully and put it back in the backpack. She thought about running. She'd run before, twice. Once at 9, from the Whelans, 3 blocks in bare feet before a police officer caught her behind a gas station. Once at 10, from the Okafor group home, almost made it to the bus station before Denise Bowman tracked her down and gave her that look. The one that said, "I'm too tired for this, and you're making my job harder." Both times they brought her back. Both times nothing changed. Running was just walking in a circle with more adrenaline. But tonight something was different. Tonight the buzzing light sounded louder. Tonight the rain sounded angrier. Tonight the voices behind that frosted glass door sounded more final, more certain, more done. And tonight, for the first time in years, Haven remembered something her mother had said. Rebecca Morelli had been a nurse before the pills took her. A real nurse. The kind who worked double shifts in oncology wards and held strangers' hands while they died. Haven didn't remember much about her mother's good years because she'd been too young, but she remembered fragments. The smell of hospital soap. A stethoscope hanging from a rearview mirror. Laughter in a kitchen that might have been yellow. And one night, sitting in a parked car outside a pharmacy while her mother's hands shook and her eyes looked like shattered glass, Rebecca had grabbed Haven's wrist and said something Haven never understood until right now, sitting on this bench, listening to strangers decide her future. "If everything falls apart," Rebecca had whispered, her breath smelling like something chemical and wrong. "You find the Storm Riders. You find their garage on Kessler Avenue. You tell them who your mama is. They won't turn you away." Haven had been 6 years old. She hadn't known what Storm Riders meant. She hadn't known what Kessler Avenue was. She'd barely understood the sentence, but she'd remembered it. The way children remember things that sound like secrets, things that feel heavier than the words themselves, things whispered by someone who already knew they were disappearing. Rebecca Morelli had disappeared 4 months later. Overdose. Not the kind that kills you all at once. The kind that kills you slowly, piece by piece, until the state steps in and takes your daughter and you become a name in a file that nobody opens anymore. Haven stared at the rain on the window. Kessler Avenue. She didn't know where it was. She didn't know if the Storm Riders still existed. She didn't know if her mother's name meant anything to anyone anymore, or if Rebecca Morelli had been telling the truth, or if the whole memory was something Haven had built inside her own head to survive the years of nothing. But in 5 hours and 40 minutes, Judge Hawk would sign that order. And Haven Morelli was done being furniture. She stood up, pulled the backpack over her shoulders, walked past the frosted glass door without looking at it, took the stairwell down to the first floor because the elevator made noise, and noise meant attention, and attention meant someone stopping her. The security guard at the front entrance was asleep in his chair, with a newspaper folded across his chest, mouth open, breath rattling through his throat like an old engine. Haven pushed through the courthouse doors and stepped into November. The cold hit her like a wall, not the kind of cold you adjust to, the kind that steals your breath and replaces it with something sharp and empty. Rain slashed sideways across the courthouse steps, and the wind carried it into her face like needles. Her hoodie was useless. Her sneakers were already soaked. Within 30 seconds, her hands were numb. She started walking. Kessler Avenue. She'd looked it up on a library computer 6 months ago during a moment of desperate curiosity she'd never acted on. 8.4 miles from the courthouse, southeast, past the rail yards, past the industrial district, past the part of Ridgeton where streetlights stopped working and nobody complained because nobody who mattered lived there. 8 miles in freezing rain. At night. Alone. The streets were empty, the kind of empty that happens when a city decides a storm is bad enough to stay inside, when even the drunks and the insomniacs and the restless find somewhere warm and wait. Haven walked down the center of Marlowe Street because the sidewalks were flooded and the gutters ran like rivers, and there was nobody driving anyway. Her sneakers made wet slapping sounds against the asphalt. Her breath came out in clouds that the wind tore apart instantly. By the second mile, she couldn't feel her fingers. By the third mile, she was shaking so hard her teeth sounded like someone shuffling a deck of cards inside her skull. By the fourth mile, she started talking to herself. Not words exactly, just sounds. low, humming sounds that vibrated in her chest and reminded her body that she was still here, still moving, still alive. She'd read somewhere that hypothermia makes you sleepy, that it tricks your brain into thinking you're warm, that people who freeze to death often smile. She didn't smile. She crossed the rail yards at mile 5, climbing over a chain-link fence with frozen fingers that could barely grip the wire. She cut her palm on a jagged edge and watched the blood mix with rainwater and disappear. The industrial district was darker, warehouses with broken windows, loading docks with weeds growing through the concrete, the skeletal remains of a manufacturing economy that had packed up and moved somewhere cheaper decades ago. The only sound was rain and wind and the distant hum of the highway overpass half a mile north. At mile 6, she saw a light. It was faint, orange, flickering, coming from beneath an overpass where someone had built a fire in a metal drum. A man sat beside it, wrapped in something that might have been a sleeping bag, and Haven gave him a wide berth because she'd learned long ago that men under overpasses could be anything, and the risk was never worth the warmth. The man didn't look up. The fire popped and hissed in the rain. At mile 7, she heard them. Engines. Not car engines. Not truck engines. Something different. Something deeper, rawer. A sound that came from the belly of machines built to shake the ground. The rumble rolled through the wet streets like distant thunder that never stopped, and Haven followed it the way a drowning person follows the sound of air. Kessler Avenue appeared like a scar across the industrial district, a single block of concrete and neon wedged between abandoned warehouses and a dead rail spur. At the end of the block, beneath a sign that buzzed and flickered in the rain, sat a building that looked like it had been built by men who didn't care about building codes or aesthetic opinions. Cinder block walls, a corrugated metal roof, 3 garage bays with steel doors, 2 closed, 1 open, spilling yellow light, and engine noise and cigarette smoke into the storm like an open wound. Above the open bay, welded from scrap metal and mounted on rusted brackets, hung a sign, Storm Riders MC. Motorcycles lined the front of the building, not pristine showroom machines, scarred, heavy, loud things with scratched paint and cracked leather seats and exhaust pipes stained black from years of hard roads. Harleys mostly. Built for weight and sound and the kind of distance that puts states between you and whatever you're running from. Rain collected in pools between them, and the neon light from the sign turned the water orange and red and something close to the color of blood. Haven stopped at the edge of the parking lot. Her legs were shaking. Her hands were blue. Her backpack felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and the guardianship form inside it felt like it weighed 1,000. Through the open garage bay, she could see figures moving, large men in leather, their voices low and rough, their shadows stretching across oil-stained concrete floors. She could smell exhaust and cigarette smoke and coffee, and something mechanical, something that reminded her of the auto shop classes she'd once watched through a school window but never been allowed to take. She was 12 years old, she weighed 81 pounds. She was standing in freezing rain outside the headquarters of men her caseworker would call criminals, men the state would call dangerous, men the world looked at and saw only the leather and the noise and the scars and the records. She had no other options. Haven Morelli walked across the parking lot, stepped over a puddle that reflected neon and exhaust smoke, and walked through the open garage bay into the Storm Riders clubhouse. Every conversation stopped. It didn't taper off. It didn't fade. It stopped, the way a room goes silent when something happens that nobody knows how to process. 30 men turned toward the sound of small, wet sneakers on concrete, and 30 faces shifted from confusion to alarm to something harder to name. The girl standing beneath the fluorescent lights looked like a drowned ghost. Rainwater dripped from her sleeves and pooled around her shoes. Her lips were pale. Her eyes were enormous, dark, exhausted, and absolutely unafraid in a way that made several men uncomfortable because children who aren't afraid of anything have usually been afraid of everything for so long that the mechanism broke. The garage smelled like motor oil and stale beer and leather conditioner and the sharp bite of winter air coming through the open bay. Tool chests lined the walls. A Harley Softail sat on a lift with its engine exposed like an open rib cage. Somewhere in the back, a radio played something low and twangy that nobody was listening to. A man at the center table stood up slowly. Trace Warden McCall was 53 years old, 6'2", and built like something designed to absorb impact. His beard was streaked with gray. His hands were scarred from a decade of engine work and 2 tours in a desert that still showed up in his sleep uninvited. He wore a leather cut with patches that told stories. The club's insignia on the back, service ribbons no one asked about on the front, and a president's patch that sat over his left chest like a second heartbeat. His eyes were the color of wet concrete, and they studied the girl the way a combat medic studies a wound. Not with pity, not with sentimentality, but with the practiced calm of someone who has seen damage before and knows that the first response is always assessment. "You lost," he said. Haven didn't answer immediately. She scanned the room the way she'd learned to scan every room she'd ever entered. Exits first, then threats, then the person with the most authority. Her eyes found the exits. Her eyes found the threats. Her eyes landed on Warden. "No," she said. Her voice was small but steady, the voice of someone who had been practicing being brave in rooms that never rewarded it. "I'm not lost." Warden waited. "My name is Haven Morelli," she said. "My mother's name was Rebecca." The name landed in the room like a grenade with the pin pulled. Something shifted in Warden's face. Not a lot. Not enough for most people to notice. But the men who'd been watching him for years saw it. The slight tightening around the jaw, the almost imperceptible flicker in those concrete eyes, the way his hand moved half an inch toward the table edge and stopped. Behind him, a biker named Colt set down his beer bottle without looking at it. Another man, heavy, tattooed, wearing a bandana over a shaved head, straightened in his chair like someone had run a wire through his spine. "Rebecca Morelli," Warden repeated. Not a question. Haven nodded. Water dripped from her hair and hit the concrete floor in a rhythm that sounded louder than it should have. Silence. The kind that has weight and texture and a temperature slightly lower than the air around it. Warden walked around the table. His boots sounded heavy against the floor, steel-toed, worn, the kind of boots that had walked through things this girl couldn't imagine and things she absolutely could. He stopped 6 feet from her, not close enough to intimidate, not far enough to dismiss. "Your mama," he said. "She used to work at Ridgeton General?" "Oncology ward," Haven said. "Before." "Before." Warden repeated the word like he was turning it over in his mouth, testing its edges. He knew what before meant. Everyone in this room knew what before meant. Before was the cliff edge that separated the person you used to be from the wreckage you became. 12 years ago, Rebecca Morelli had been the night shift nurse assigned to Warden's wife Marie during her second round of chemo. The worst round. The round that made Marie vomit blood and lose her hair and cry in a hospital bathroom at 3 in the morning while the rest of the ward slept. Rebecca had found her there. Rebecca had sat on the cold tile floor beside her and held her hand and said nothing, not a single word, for 45 minutes. Just sat there. Just held on. When Marie came home that week, she told Warden about the nurse who stayed, and Warden had driven to the hospital and tried to give Rebecca $5,000 in cash, and Rebecca had laughed in his face and told him to spend it on flowers for his wife instead. He'd never forgotten that. Some debts don't have numbers. "Where is she now?" Warden asked, but his voice had already changed, softer at the edges, like he already knew. "Gone," Haven said. 4 years ago. The word sat between them. Warden's jaw worked beneath his beard. He looked at the girl. Soaked, shaking, half-frozen, standing in a room full of men who could break her without trying, and saw something that cracked open a door in his chest he'd spent years welding shut. "Who's taking care of you?" "Nobody." Haven reached into her backpack. Her fingers were stiff and blue and clumsy, and it took her 3 tries to pull out the folded guardianship form. She placed it on the table beside her. The paper was damp. The lines were smudged, but the signature line at the bottom was perfectly empty, perfectly clear, perfectly waiting. "The court's going to put me in a state facility tomorrow morning," she said. "Permanent placement. No more foster homes. No more families." She looked at the form, then at Warden, then at the 30 men staring at her from their chairs and their corners and their shadows. "My mom told me to find you. She said you wouldn't turn me away." Nobody moved. She said if everything fell apart, I should come here. Haven's voice cracked on the last word. Not dramatically, not cinematically. Just a hairline fracture in the wall she'd been building for 6 years. The wall that kept her standing, the wall that kept her quiet, the wall that made her furniture. She pressed her lips together and swallowed it. She'd had practice. The rain outside grew louder. Thunder rolled through the walls. Warden looked at the form on the table. He looked at the girl. He looked at the room full of men who were watching him with expressions that ranged from shock to confusion to something raw and exposed that none of them would ever admit to feeling. "Colt," Warden said without turning around, "close the bay door." The heavy steel door rolled down with a grinding sound that sealed the garage from the storm. The sudden absence of wind made the room feel smaller, warmer, closer. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The radio played. Someone's beer bottle clinked against the table. "Grease," Warden said. "Get her a towel. And coffee. And whatever's left in the kitchen that isn't 3 days old." A massive man with forearms like bridge cables stood up without a word and disappeared through a door at the back. "Nails," Warden said. "Call Delgado. Tell him I need him here in 30 minutes and I don't care what time it is." "Delgado the lawyer?" A thin man with sharp eyes leaned forward. "Warden, it's almost midnight. Did I stutter?" Nails pulled out his phone. Warden turned back to Haven. He pulled a chair from beneath the table, a heavy wooden chair with oil stains on the seat, and set it in front of her. "Sit down," he said. Haven looked at the chair. She looked at Warden. She didn't sit. "Are you going to sign it?" she asked. "Sit down." His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't gentle either. It was the voice of a man who gave orders because the situation required them, and because someone had to, and there was no negotiation behind it, just the flat certainty of a person who'd spent 30 years making decisions for people who needed them, made. Haven sat. Grease returned with a towel that smelled like motor oil and a mug of coffee that was too hot and too strong, and absolutely the best thing Haven had ever tasted in her life. She wrapped the towel around her shoulders and held the mug with both hands, and felt the heat seep into her frozen fingers like something waking up after a long sleep. Warden sat across from her. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Not the beginning. Start from the part where you decided walking 8 miles in a November storm to find a bunch of bikers was a better idea than staying in that courthouse." Haven stared at the coffee. Steam rose between them and dissolved. "Because the courthouse wasn't going to save me," she said, "and nobody else was coming." Something cracked in the room. Not a sound, a feeling. The kind of fracture that runs through a group of people when someone says something so honest it strips the varnish off everything and leaves the raw wood showing. A biker near the wall, young, maybe 25, with a scar across his eyebrow and a jacket that still smelled new, made a sound in his throat and looked away. Another man, older, heavier, with a Vietnam-era tattoo on his neck, set both hands flat on the table in front of him and stared at them like they belonged to someone he used to know. Haven told them. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. The foster homes, the group homes, the gardeners who sent her back because she didn't smile enough. The caseworker who lost her file twice. The nights in courthouse hallways and institutional waiting rooms. And the back seats of state cars driven by people who never asked how she was doing because they already knew the answer wouldn't change anything. She told them about the hearing tomorrow. About Judge Hawk. About the permanent placement order that would erase what was left of her from the system's conscience and file her away in a building where children went in and statistics came out. She told them about the form. Emergency guardianship transfer, she said, tapping the damp paper. If someone signs line 22 before the hearing, the judge has to review it. It doesn't mean they approve it, but it stops the placement, at least temporarily. Warden picked up the form. Read it. His eyes moved slowly across the smudged text, and the room waited. "You stole this from the clerk's office," he said. She was on the phone. For the first time, something that might have been the distant cousin of a smile crossed Warden's face. It was gone before it arrived. "And you walked 8 miles, he said. 8.4. In November. I can count months." Warden set the form down. He pressed both hands flat on the table. The same gesture the older biker had made moments ago, palms down, fingers spread, the universal posture of men trying to hold themselves in place while something beneath them shifts. He turned and looked at the room. 30 men looked back. These weren't clean men. These weren't men with 401ks and homeowners insurance and weekend soccer leagues. Every man in this room carried a record, a scar, a story that started with something broken and never fully healed. Half of them were veterans who'd come home from wars the country forgot about and found that the world they'd fought for didn't have a chair with their name on it. The other half were men who'd been chewed up by the same system that was chewing up Haven: foster care, juvie, probation, poverty, the long, slow grind of being invisible in a country that only noticed you when you broke something. They'd found each other the way damaged things always find each other, not through recruitment or advertising or ideology, through gravity, through the simple animal recognition of shared wreckage. The Storm Riders weren't a gang. They weren't a brand. They were a wall built from broken bricks, and they stood because broken bricks, it turns out, locked together tighter than whole ones. "This girl's mother," Warden said, "saved my wife's life. I don't mean that as a metaphor. I mean, Marie would be in the ground right now if Rebecca Morelli hadn't been in that hospital that night." The room absorbed this. "Now, her daughter is sitting in our garage asking us a question I don't think any of us knows how to answer. But I'll tell you what I know." He picked up the form and held it so the room could see the empty signature line. "If one of us signs this, it means lawyers and judges and social workers crawling through every inch of our lives. It means background checks and home inspections and people with clipboards deciding whether we're fit to raise a child. It means risk, real risk, for every single one of us." He set the form down. "If none of us signs it, this kid goes into a state facility tomorrow morning and disappears. And we go back to drinking beer and fixing engines and pretending we didn't see her standing in our garage looking like the world already gave up on her." Silence. Haven stared at the coffee in her hands. She didn't look up. She didn't plead. She'd used up every ounce of courage she had walking through that garage door, and now all she had left was this: sitting very still, holding a mug of too strong coffee, and waiting for 30 strangers to decide if she was worth the trouble. Colt spoke first. "I'll sign it." Warden looked at him. "You understand what that means?" "Means I'm signing a piece of paper," Colt said. "Done stupider things for less reason." The young biker with the scar, his name was Decker, leaned forward. "Can more than one person sign?" Haven's head came up. For the first time since she'd walked through the door, something moved behind her eyes. Not hope, not yet. Something before hope. The thing that makes hope possible. Warden looked at the form again, read it again, ran his finger along line 22. "It says name of proposed guardian," he said slowly. "Singular, but it doesn't say only one." "Then I'm signing two," Decker said. "So am I," said the man with the Vietnam tattoo. "Count me in," said Grease, standing in the doorway with another pot of coffee. And then it happened. One by one, voice by voice, chairs scraping against concrete, boots hitting the floor, men standing up around that garage like dominoes falling in reverse, not collapsing, but rising. 30 voices. 30 names. 30 damaged, scarred, imperfect men who had never been anyone's first choice for anything volunteering to be legally responsible for a child they'd met 12 minutes ago. Haven's hands shook around the coffee mug. Not from the cold this time. Warden watched the room. Something moved through his face that he would never describe and no one would ever ask about. A current running beneath the concrete surface, deep and old and dangerous in the way that real feeling always is when you've spent decades burying it. He picked up a pen from the table. He looked at Haven. "Your mama," he said quietly, "was right about us." He signed line 22. Then he passed the pen to Colt. Haven pressed her face into the oil-stained towel and made no sound at all, and the men around her pretended not to notice because they understood, all of them, in their own broken ways, that some tears are structural, not emotional. Some tears are the sound of walls coming down. 20 minutes later, Delgado arrived. Victor Delgado was 51, divorced twice, and the only attorney in Ridgeton County who'd take a call from the storm riders at midnight without hesitation. He walked into the garage carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a suit that looked like he'd slept in it, which he had. He looked at Haven. He looked at the form. He looked at the 30 signatures crammed into a space designed for one. "You're all insane," he said. "Noted," Warden said. "Now tell us how to make it legal." Delgado sat down, opened the briefcase, and began pulling out documents. His face was tired, but his eyes were sharp. And as he read the form and listened to Haven's situation and reviewed the state's custody protocols, something happened to his expression that he tried very hard to hide. Something softened. Something opened. He'd spent 20 years defending men the system called dangerous, and tonight a girl who the same system called disposable was sitting in front of him asking for the same thing every client he'd ever represented wanted: someone to stand between her and the machine. "Okay," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Here's the problem. Emergency guardianship requires a demonstrated relationship between guardian and minor. You've known this child for," he checked his watch, "40 minutes. Her mother saved my wife," Warden said. "That's not a legal relationship, Trace." "Then make it one." Delgado stared at him. "You want me to build a legal framework for collective guardianship by a motorcycle club before a judicial hearing that starts in—" He checked his watch again. 7 hours? 6 hours and 52 minutes, Haven said quietly. Everyone looked at her. "I counted," she said. Delgado closed his eyes, opened them, looked at the ceiling, looked at the 30 men who were looking at him like he was the last wall between this child and oblivion. "I'm going to need more coffee," he said. The garage erupted into organized chaos. Nails began pulling documents from a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in years: incorporation papers, tax records, community service logs. Grease cleared the center table and covered it with legal pads. Colt started making phone calls to people whose names Delgado wrote on napkins. A family court clerk he knew, a social worker who owed him a favor, a retired judge who might be willing to consult at 1 in the morning if the reason was good enough. Warden sat beside Haven. "You should sleep," he said. "Can't. Can't or won't." Haven looked at him. In her eyes was something Warden recognized from his own reflection: the specific, calibrated exhaustion of a person who learned early that closing your eyes means losing control, and losing control means losing everything. "If I sleep," she said, "I'll wake up and this won't be real." Warden didn't argue. He didn't comfort her. He didn't promise her anything. He just sat there, 6'2" of scarred leather and engine grease and buried grief, and let her stay awake beside him while the storm raged outside and lawyers argued inside and the clock above the garage door counted down the hours until a judge would decide if 30 broken men could hold one broken girl together. At 2:47 a.m., Warden's phone rang. He answered it, listened. His face didn't change, but his hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles went white. "When?" he said. He listened again. "How much?" He listened. "Who filed it?" He listened one more time. Then he hung up and sat very still for a long moment while the garage hummed with activity around him. "Delgado," he said. The lawyer looked up from a stack of papers. "We have a problem." Warden's voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a man who has just received information that changes everything and is deciding how much of the damage to show. "The state filed an emergency motion 30 minutes ago. They know she's gone. They know she's here. And they're sending marshals at first light to take her back." The garage went quiet. Haven set down her coffee mug. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The word marshals moved through the garage like a virus. You could see it infect each man differently. Colt's jaw locked sideways like he was biting down on something made of metal. Decker's hand dropped to the table edge and gripped it. Grease set the coffee pot down too hard, and the glass cracked against the burner plate, and nobody flinched because nobody was listening to anything except the silence that followed Warden's voice. Haven sat perfectly still. She'd heard the word before. Marshals had come to the Okafor group home once, looking for a 16-year-old boy who'd run. She remembered the boots. She remembered the badges. She remembered the way the boy looked when they brought him back. Not scared, not angry, just empty. Drained of whatever had made him run in the first place, like they'd confiscated the last thing inside him that still worked. How long? Delgado asked. His pen had stopped moving. His legal pad sat in front of him, covered in notes that suddenly looked like a language nobody spoke anymore. First light, Warden said. So we've got about 4 hours. That's not enough time to file a countermotion. Then find something that is enough time. Delgado rubbed his face with both hands. The sound of his palms against stubble was loud in the quiet room. Trace, listen to me. If federal marshals show up and this child is here and you refuse to hand her over, that's not a custody dispute anymore. That's obstruction. That's harboring. That's every man in this room catching charges that don't wash off. Nobody said anything about refusing. Then what exactly is the plan? Warden didn't answer. He stood at the table with his hands flat on the wood, fingers spread, shoulders carrying something heavier than his leather cut in his 53 years and his 2 tours combined. The fluorescent light above him buzzed. The cracked coffee pot leaked a thin line of brown liquid across the counter. Outside, the storm had shifted. The rain was lighter now, but the wind was worse, howling through the gap beneath the garage door like an animal testing a cage. The plan, Warden said slowly, is we walk into that courthouse before they come to us. We don't wait for marshals. We don't hide. We show up at that hearing with this girl, with these signatures, with whatever legal framework Delgado can build in the next 4 hours, and we stand in front of Judge Hawk and make our case. Our case, repeated a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned. The man leaning against the far wall hadn't spoken until now. His name was Roach, Dennis Rochford, 47, vice president of the Storm Riders for 9 years. He was lean where Warden was solid, sharp where Warden was heavy, and the angles of his face looked like they'd been carved from something that resented being shaped. He had a cigarette behind his ear that he never seemed to light, and eyes that tracked a room the way a scope tracks a target. Slow, patient, missing nothing. Our case, Roach said again. He pushed off the wall and walked forward. His boots made no sound. He'd learned to walk quietly in places where sound meant death, and the skill had never left him. And what case is that exactly? 30 convicted felons asking a family court judge to hand them a 12-year-old girl? Not all of us have felonies, Decker said. Enough of us do. Roach stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at Haven, not unkindly, but without the softness that had infected the room since she walked in, and the absence of that softness made several men uncomfortable because Roach was usually right about the things nobody wanted to hear. Kid, I'm sorry about your situation. I mean that. But do you understand what happens to this club if we walk into that courtroom? Haven looked at him. They'll pull every record, Roach continued, every arrest, every charge, every dismissed case, and every plea deal, and every sealed juvenile file that some prosecutor with a grudge will find a way to unseal. They won't see 30 men who fixed their lives. They'll see 30 mugshots. And then they'll use those mugshots to take you away and bury this club in legal fees that'll bankrupt us before spring. The garage was quiet. The truth has a specific sound when it enters a room. Not loud, not dramatic, just the low grinding noise of something that can't be argued with settling into place. Roach, Warden said. I'm not done. Roach turned to face him. The 2 men stood on opposite sides of the table like chess pieces that had been moving toward each other for years. You made a promise to a dead woman's daughter based on a debt you owe a dead woman. I respect that. But you made it for all of us, Trace. You stood in front of this room and said, if one signs, we all sign. And now every man here is on the hook for a decision you made in 60 seconds. You stood up too, Colt said. I watched you. I stood up because the room was standing. That's momentum, not conviction. Roach pulled the cigarette from behind his ear and rolled it between his fingers. I'm asking the question nobody else will ask. What happens when the state digs into our background and finds out about Warden's assault charge from '09? What happens when they pull Grease's DUI? What happens when they find Decker's sealed juvie record? What happens when some social worker walks into this clubhouse and sees 30 guys who look exactly like the kind of people family courts are designed to keep children away from? Haven's grip tightened around the coffee mug. She didn't look away from Roach. She studied him the way she'd studied every adult who'd ever stood between her and something she needed, measuring, calculating, determining if this was a wall she could climb or one she'd have to go around. "What happens," she said quietly, "is the same thing that always happens. Adults decide I'm not worth the trouble, and I go back in the system." The sentence landed like a blade laid flat on the table, not pointed at anyone, just there, visible, cold. Roach looked at her for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes that he controlled quickly and completely, the way a man controls a flinch when you throw something at his face. He put the cigarette back behind his ear. "I'm not saying you're not worth it, kid. I'm saying worth and risk are two different conversations, and this room is only having one of them." "Then let's have both," Warden said. "Right now. Anyone who wants out, say it now. No judgment, no consequences. You walk out that door and nobody in this club says a word about it." The room held its breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Warden waited 30 seconds. Then a minute. The clock above the garage door ticked loud enough to count. Outside, the wind shifted direction and the garage door rattled in its frame like something knocking. "Good," Warden said. He turned to Delgado. "Build it." Delgado opened his briefcase again. His hands moved with the mechanical precision of a man who has decided to stop questioning a decision and start executing it. "I need 3 things," he said. "First, a legal entity. This club needs to be restructured as a registered community guardianship organization before that hearing. I can do that with the incorporation papers you already have, but I need amendments filed and notarized. Second, I need character witnesses. Not bikers, civilians. People in this community who will stand in front of a judge and say the storm riders are more than their rap sheets. Business owners, neighbors, anyone who's ever seen you do something that doesn't look like a crime. Third," he paused, looked at Haven. "Third, I need you to be ready to speak." "I can speak," Haven said. "Not like that. Not like a kid telling a sad story. The judge has heard 1,000 sad stories. She's immune. I need you to speak like someone who made a rational decision under impossible circumstances. I need you to explain clearly, calmly, without tears, why you chose these men. Not because you had no other options, because you had one option that mattered, and you took it." Haven stared at him. "That's the same thing." "In life, yes. In court, no." The next 3 hours dissolved into controlled frenzy. The garage became a command center. Nails commandeered the back office and began drafting amendment documents on a laptop so old the keys stuck. Colt disappeared into the rain and came back 40 minutes later with a notary named Wendell, who looked terrified and charged $300 cash and didn't ask questions. Grease made phone calls from a list Delgado provided. A diner owner named Marge Kessler, who'd known the club for 15 years. A mechanic named Paulie Orta, who shared shop space with the storm riders on weekends. A retired teacher named Cora Blanchard, who ran a literacy program the club had quietly funded for 6 years without telling anyone. Decker sat with Haven at the corner table. He was 25. Scar across his right eyebrow from a bottle that hit him at 14 in a group home, not unlike the ones Haven had survived. He'd been in the system too. Different city, different state, same machine. Aged out at 18 with a garbage bag of belongings and a bus ticket to nowhere specific. Found the storm riders at 21. Found something that functioned like a floor beneath his feet for the first time in his life. He didn't tell Haven any of this. Not yet. Not with words. Instead, he set a plate in front of her. 2 pieces of toast slightly burned with peanut butter applied by someone who had clearly never made food for a child before. The peanut butter was too thick on one side and barely there on the other. It was the most imperfect, most sincere plate of food Haven had ever been given. "Eat," he said. "I'm not hungry." Nobody asked. Haven looked at the toast. She looked at Decker. She picked up a piece and bit into it, and the peanut butter stuck to the roof of her mouth in a way that was ordinary and warm, and so far removed from courthouses and martial warrants that she almost choked on the normalcy of it. "Were you in the system?" she asked. Decker didn't answer for a moment. He turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table, the ceramic scraping against wood, and stared at something that wasn't in the room. 7 homes, he said. 4 years of juvie, 1 garbage bag. Haven chewed, swallowed. Did it get better? Decker looked at the garage around them, the men arguing over legal documents, the lawyer scribbling on yellow pads, the president of a motorcycle club standing beneath a buzzing fluorescent light at 3 a.m. trying to save a girl he didn't know 12 hours ago. It got different, he said. Different was enough. At 4:15 a.m., Warden's phone rang again. He stepped into the back hallway to take it. The hallway was narrow and smelled like old paint and the cold that leaked through the cinder block walls. He leaned against the wall and answered. Yeah. The voice on the other end was female, tired, speaking quickly. Marie, Warden said. Slow down. His wife, 51, cancer survivor. The woman Rebecca Morelli had held in a hospital bathroom at 3 a.m. 12 years ago. Marie McCall was at home in bed when the calls started. First from Nails, then from Colt, then from someone at the courthouse whose name she didn't recognize. She'd been awake for an hour now, putting together pieces of a story that didn't make sense and made all the sense in the world. Is she safe? Marie asked. She's here. Is she eating? Warden almost smiled. Almost. Decker made her toast. Decker can't make toast. She's eating it anyway. A pause. The kind of pause that happens between two people who have been married long enough that silence carries more information than words. Warden could hear his wife breathing. He could hear the old clock in their kitchen ticking through the phone. He could hear the furnace running. Rebecca's daughter, Marie said. Yeah. Another pause. Longer this time. Bring her home, Trace. Warden closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against the cold wall. The cinder block felt like ice against his skin, and he stayed there, leaning, breathing, holding the phone against his ear like a lifeline thrown across the distance between who he was and who he needed to be in the next 4 hours. That's what I'm trying to do, he said. No. Marie's voice changed, harder. The voice of a woman who had stared down cancer twice and beaten it both times through sheer refusal to negotiate with death. I mean, bring her home, our home, tonight, after the hearing. Whatever happens in that courtroom, she sleeps in a real bed tonight. Not a clubhouse, not a state car, a bed. Marie, don't Marie me. I spent 12 years knowing I owed that woman my life and having no way to pay it back. Now her daughter is standing in your garage and you're going to tell me we don't have room? Warden said nothing. We have room, Trace. I know we do. He hung up, stood in the hallway for another 30 seconds, breathing. Then he walked back into the garage and every man in the room could see something had shifted in his face. The weight was still there, heavier than before, but beneath it was something else. Something that looked like a foundation being poured. At 5:30 a.m., Roach found Warden alone at the table. Everyone else was occupied. Delgado was on the phone with the family court clerk. Nails was printing documents in the back office. Colt and Grease were loading a van with the paperwork and supplies they'd need for the hearing. Haven was asleep. She'd fought it for hours, but her body had finally overruled her fear, and she'd fallen asleep in the corner chair with the oil-stained towel wrapped around her shoulders and her head tilted against the wall at an angle that would hurt when she woke up. Decker sat 3 feet from her, not sleeping, not talking, just present in the way a guard dog is present, still and watching and absolutely certain of his purpose. Roach sat across from Warden. He set 2 mugs of coffee between them. The gesture was peace offering and war counsel and something older than both. I need to tell you something, Roach said, and you're not going to like it. Warden picked up his coffee. When have I ever liked anything you tell me? Roach didn't smile. I made some calls, independently, while Delgado was working. Calls to who? A contact at the state's Child Protective Division. Someone I know from when my sister's kids went through the system. She owed me. Roach leaned forward. His voice dropped, not because anyone was close enough to hear, but because the weight of what he was about to say required a lower register. Trace, the state didn't file that emergency motion because the girl ran. They file motions when kids run all the time. That's paperwork. That's routine. Then why? Because someone called it in. Someone told the state specifically where Haven was headed. Someone told them the storm riders were involved, and the state's response wasn't routine. It was elevated. Immediate martial deployment. That's not what happens when a foster kid goes missing. That's what happens when someone with authority makes a phone call and says, "Act now." Warden set his coffee down. The mug hit the table harder than he intended. Brown liquid sloshed over the rim and pooled against the wood. Who? My contact didn't have a name. She had a department. The call came from inside the county's family court system. Roach paused. Let that land. Someone in that courthouse knew the girl was going to run, knew where she was going, knew about us. The buzzing fluorescent light above them popped once, flickered, steadied. Shadows jumped across the walls and settled. That's impossible, Warden said. She didn't tell anyone. She stole the form and walked out. She stole the form from the clerk's desk, the clerk who was on the phone. What if the clerk wasn't distracted? What if the form was left there for her to find? Warden stared at Roach. The implications stacked up behind his eyes like rounds being loaded into a magazine. 1, 2, 3, each one heavier than the last. You're saying this was a setup. I'm saying something doesn't fit. A 12-year-old walks 8 miles in a storm to a biker clubhouse she's never visited based on a 6-year-old memory from an addict mother, and within 30 minutes of her arrival, the state knows exactly where she is and deploys marshals. That's not bad luck. That's choreography. The air in the garage changed. Temperature didn't drop, but something did. Some invisible barometric pressure that every man in the room would have felt if they'd been paying attention. Warden turned and looked at Haven sleeping in the corner. The towel had slipped off one shoulder. Her face, relaxed in sleep, looked younger than 12. It looked like the face of a child who had never been given permission to look like a child while awake. And now, unconscious, the mask had finally fallen, and what was underneath was just a kid. Just a tired, underfed, soaked, broken kid who wanted someone to sign a piece of paper. It doesn't change anything, Warden said. The hell it doesn't. If someone inside the court system is manipulating this girl's case, using her as bait, setting us up for obstruction charges, building a case against the club, then walking into that hearing tomorrow morning is exactly what they want us to do. We're still going. Trace, we are still going. Warden's voice didn't rise. It lowered. Went down into the basement of his register where it became something that wasn't a voice anymore, but a frequency. A vibration that moved through the table and into Roach's hands. If someone set a trap, we walk into it with our eyes open. If someone's using this kid, we take her anyway. Because the alternative is leaving her in the hands of whoever did this, and I didn't survive 2 tours in 20 years of this club to abandon a child because the math got complicated. Roach sat back. He looked at Warden the way he'd looked at him 100 times before, with the frustrated, exhausted, grudging respect of a man who knows his best friend is about to do something dangerously right. You're going to get us killed, Roach said. Probably. Or arrested. Also probable. And you're going to do it anyway. Without hesitation. Roach picked up his coffee, drank it, set it down, pulled the cigarette from behind his ear, looked at it, put it back. Then we need to know who made that call, he said, before we walk into that courtroom. Because if there's someone inside the system who wants this girl buried, they're going to be sitting in that room when we arrive, and I'd like to know their face before they see ours. Agreed. I'll make more calls. Roach stood, paused, looked at Haven one more time. She's got her mother's eyes, he said quietly. Same thing, same look, like she's already seen the ending and she's just waiting for everyone else to catch up. He walked away. Warden sat alone at the table. The clock above the garage door read 5:47 a.m. The hearing was at 8. In 2 hours and 13 minutes, 30 men in leather would walk through the doors of Ridgeton County Family Courthouse and stand in front of a judge and ask for something no court had ever granted before. And somewhere inside that courthouse, someone who knew Haven was coming had already made arrangements to make sure it didn't work. At 6:15, Warden woke Haven. He did it by setting a fresh cup of coffee on the chair arm beside her. The click of ceramic against wood was enough. Her eyes opened instantly. Not the slow, blinking awakening of someone rising from rest, but the immediate total alertness of a person whose body has been trained to register every sound as a potential threat. She was awake and scanning the room before her first breath. It's 6:15, Warden said. We leave in an hour. Haven looked at the coffee, looked at the garage, saw the men moving with organized purpose, pulling on jackets, checking phones, having conversations in low voices that stopped when they noticed her watching. Something was different. The energy had shifted while she slept. The warmth from the night before was still there, but it was running alongside something harder now, something colder, something that smelled like preparation rather than celebration. "Something happened," she said. Warden looked at her. This girl missed nothing. She read rooms the way his recon unit used to read terrain, not for what was visible, but for what had changed since the last time she looked. "Nothing you need to worry about right now." That means something happened. It means get up, drink the coffee, and let Marie's clothes fit you. He held out a folded stack, a clean sweater, a pair of jeans that would be too big but had a belt, wool socks, a jacket lined with something warm. Marie had driven them over at 5 in the morning without being asked, because Marie McCall was the kind of woman who knew what was needed before anyone thought to need it. Haven took the clothes. She went to the bathroom in the back hallway and changed. The sweater smelled like laundry detergent and something floral, a specific domestic scent that Haven had no category for because no home she'd lived in had ever smelled like someone cared about what the clothes smelled like. She pressed her face into the fabric and breathed, and stood there for 30 seconds in a bathroom that smelled like industrial cleaner and rust, and let the sweater smell fill the empty parts of her chest that she usually kept locked. When she came out, the garage was ready. 30 men in leather cuts stood in formation without being told to form up. Boots on concrete, helmets in hands. The garage doors were open, and the first gray light of morning was bleeding through the storm clouds, turning the puddles in the parking lot into mirrors that reflected chrome and neon and the silhouettes of machines built for distance. The rain had stopped, but the cold hadn't. The air bit exposed skin and turned breath into clouds that hung for a moment and dissolved. Motorcycles lined up in the lot. 30 Harleys. 30 engines waiting. Delgado stood beside the van with his briefcase and a stack of documents 6 inches thick and an expression that was equal parts terror and determination. Beside him, 3 civilians waited. Marge Kessler from the diner wearing a dress she clearly hadn't worn in years. Paulie Orta in a clean flannel shirt with engine grease still visible under his fingernails. Cora Blanchard with reading glasses and a folder of her own. Warden walked to the front of the formation. He turned and faced his club. The gray morning light hit him from behind, and for a moment he was just a shape, broad, dark, outlined in cold winter dawn like something cut from iron and planted in the ground. "Nobody speaks in that courtroom unless Delgado says so," he said. "Nobody reacts to anything the state says, no matter what they call us, no matter what they bring up. You sit there, you stay quiet, and you let the work speak. If they provoke you, you swallow it. If they insult you, you swallow it. Because today is not about us. Today is about her." He looked at Haven. She stood near the van in Marie's clothes, the sweater too big, the jacket too long, her hair still damp, her eyes enormous and dark, and filled with something that was either courage or the absence of any alternative to courage, which, in the end, amounts to the same thing. "Let's ride," Warden said. 30 engines fired. The sound was volcanic. It rolled through the industrial district like a declaration of war made in a language built from pistons and exhaust, and the collective refusal of broken men to stay broken. Windows rattled in nearby warehouses. Puddles trembled in the parking lot. The neon sign above the garage flickered in the vibration and buzzed its last buzz before someone killed the power. Haven climbed into the van beside Delgado. Through the windshield, she watched 30 motorcycles pull out of the lot in a column so tight and so synchronized it looked rehearsed. But it wasn't rehearsed. It was instinct. The instinct of men who had ridden together through weather and war zones and years of being told they didn't matter. Men who moved as a single unit because moving alone had never gotten any of them anywhere. The column rolled through the streets of Ridgeton as the city woke up. People stopped on sidewalks. Cars pulled over. A woman holding a coffee cup on a corner stared with her mouth open as 30 Harleys thundered past in formation, followed by a white van carrying a 12-year-old girl and a lawyer and 6 inches of documents that represented the most insane legal argument in the history of family court. Haven watched the bikers ride. She pressed her palm against the cold window of the van and felt the vibration of their engines through the glass, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself believe that the sound was a wall. A moving, roaring, unstoppable wall between her and everything that had ever hurt her. The Ridgeton County Family Courthouse appeared through the windshield at 7:43 a.m. Gray stone. Marble steps, tall windows reflecting the overcast sky like blind eyes. And standing at the base of those steps, arranged in a line that blocked the main entrance like a human barricade, were 6 federal marshals in dark jackets with badges visible and faces that carried the specific, professional emptiness of people authorized to take things away from other people. Behind them, standing on the top step with a folder pressed against her chest and an expression that mixed satisfaction with something darker, was a woman Haven recognized instantly, Denise Bowman, her caseworker. The woman who had lost her file twice, the woman who had sat behind a frosted glass door while Haven froze on a courthouse bench, the woman who was supposed to be her advocate. Denise was smiling, and standing beside Denise with his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was too familiar, too comfortable, too rehearsed to be coincidental, was a man Haven had never seen before. Tall, gray-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than everything in Haven's backpack combined, with a county ID badge clipped to his lapel that caught the morning light and flashed once, like a warning. Warden killed his engine at the curb. He looked at the marshals. He looked at Denise Bowman. He looked at the man in the expensive suit. Roach pulled up beside him, didn't remove his helmet. His voice came through the visor, low and tight. "That's him," Roach said. "The man standing with the caseworker. His name is Gerald Tate, Deputy Director of the county's Child Protective Division. He's the one who made the call last night." Warden stared at the courthouse steps. "And Trace?" Roach's voice dropped to something barely above the engine's idle. "I found out something else. Tate's department has a contract with Ridgemont Youth Services, a private institutional facility. They get paid per child, per year. The more kids Tate funnels into Ridgemont, the bigger the contract. Haven Morelli isn't a child to this man. She's a line item." 30 engines idled at the curb. 6 marshals stood at the base of the steps. A smiling caseworker stood beside a man who traded in children like inventory, and Haven Morelli sat in the back of a white van, wearing a dead woman's sweater, holding a damp guardianship form signed by 30 men who had just ridden through a winter storm to fight a war they didn't yet know had been designed for them to lose. Warden didn't dismount immediately. He sat on his Harley at the curb with the engine idling beneath him, and he studied the courthouse steps the way he'd once studied enemy positions from behind cover, counting bodies, measuring distance, reading postures for intent. 6 marshals. Denise Bowman, Gerald Tate. The math was bad. The math had been bad since 2:47 a.m., and it was getting worse by the minute. Behind him, 29 engines idled in formation. The collective rumble bounced off the courthouse's stone facade and came back changed, deeper, heavier, as if the building itself was absorbing the sound and returning something colder. Roach pulled alongside. His visor was still down. "Say the word, and we turn around. No shame in regrouping." "We're not regrouping." "Then we're walking into a kill box." "Wouldn't be the first time." Warden killed his engine. The sudden silence was louder than the noise had been. He swung his leg over the seat and stood, and the motion rippled backward through the formation. One by one, 29 men dismounting, 29 kickstands hitting asphalt, 29 helmets coming off and being hung on handlebars. The sound of boots on wet pavement moved through the morning like a slow drumbeat. Haven watched through the van's windshield. Her fingers were pressed against the glass so hard the tips had gone white. She could see Denise Bowman on the steps, the woman who had promised her 3 years ago, in a voice that sounded rehearsed even then, that the system was designed to protect her. The woman who forgot her name on intake forms. The woman who once left her sitting in a courthouse hallway for 6 hours without water because a parking ticket phone call was more important. Denise was still smiling. The smile hadn't moved. It sat on her face like something painted there by someone who understood the shape of smiles, but not the reason for them. "Stay in the van," Delgado said to Haven. He was gathering documents, his hands moving fast, a pen clenched between his teeth. "Until I signal, you stay right here." "Why?" "Because the marshals are here for you, and if you step out before I've established our legal position, they can take you into protective custody on site. Right now you're in a vehicle with your attorney present. That's a gray area. I need the gray area." Haven looked at the marshals, looked at Delgado, understood. Gray areas were the spaces where people like her survived, the gaps between rules, the silences between sentences, the seconds between one adult's decision and another's. She stayed. Warden walked toward the courthouse steps. He walked slowly, deliberately, the way a man walks when he knows every eye is on him, and every step is being measured and recorded. His boots hit the wet marble with a sound that carried. Behind him, Colt and Roach flanked. Not too close, not too far. The formation spread across the sidewalk in a crescent that wasn't aggressive but wasn't passive either. 30 men in leather, standing in the gray morning light, steam rising from their bodies in the cold air. The lead marshal stepped forward. Young, 30-something, clean jaw. The kind of face that had been trained to show nothing and was showing nothing now. Trace McCall? That's right. Deputy Marshal Kearns, we have a court order for the immediate recovery of Haven Morelli, minor, case number JD-2019-4471. She's been reported as a missing ward of the state since approximately 10 p.m. last night. Is she in your custody? She's with her attorney. Kearns blinked. The blink was small, but it was there, a microfracture in the professional blankness. Her attorney? Victor Delgado, licensed in this state. Retained as counsel for the minor as of 12:37 a.m. Warden's voice was flat, measured, every word placed like a brick. The minor is not missing. She voluntarily sought assistance from a community organization and was provided emergency shelter, food, and legal representation, all of which, I believe, is within her rights. Kearns looked over Warden's shoulder at the van, then at the 30 men behind him, then at the courthouse steps, where Tate and Bowman stood watching. Mr. McCall, the court order is noted, and our attorney will address it inside the courtroom in front of the judge in about... Warden checked the watch on his wrist, a battered military field watch with a cracked crystal. 12 minutes. Kearns hesitated. This wasn't in the script. Missing children were supposed to be scared, compliant, easy to recover. They were not supposed to arrive at the courthouse escorted by 30 motorcycles and a lawyer. The marshal looked up the steps at Tate, and Haven, watching from the van, saw the look that passed between them. It was fast. It was subtle. And it confirmed everything Roach had said in the garage. Kearns stepped aside. Not because he agreed, not because the law required it, because 30 men were standing on the sidewalk and the optics of a physical confrontation on the courthouse steps at 8 in the morning were exactly the kind of optics that ended careers. And Deputy Marshal Kearns liked his career. Warden turned and nodded at the van. Delgado opened the side door. Haven stepped out into the cold air. Marie's sweater was too big and the jacket sleeves covered her hands, and she looked even smaller standing outside than she had sitting inside. But her chin was level and her eyes were forward, and she walked toward Warden without looking at the marshals, without looking at Denise Bowman, without looking at Gerald Tate. She walked like someone who had been walking through hostile territory her entire life and had learned that the trick wasn't being brave. It was being too tired to be anything else. The storm riders closed around her, not dramatically, not theatrically. They simply moved the way water moves to fill a gap, and Haven was suddenly at the center of a formation of leather and denim and scarred hands and old boots, walking up the courthouse steps while the marshals watched, and Denise Bowman's smile finally flickered, and Gerald Tate's hand tightened on the folder he was holding. The doors opened. The marble hallway of Ridgeton County Family Courthouse was designed to intimidate. High ceilings, cold floors, the kind of architecture that tells you the building is more important than you are. Sound traveled here. Every footstep, every whisper, every cough bounced off the walls and came back amplified, so the 30 pairs of boots crossing that hallway sounded like 60, like 100, like an army. People stopped. Court clerks, attorneys, a woman with a stroller, a man in a business suit holding a file. Everyone stopped and watched the column of bikers move through the hall with a 12-year-old girl at its center, and nobody said a word because the sight was so incongruent, so outside the expected grammar of a family courthouse at 8 in the morning, that language failed. Courtroom 3B, Judge Sarah Hawk's chamber. Delgado went in first, then Haven, then Warden, Roach, and Colt. Then the rest of the club, filing into the gallery benches in rows that filled the courtroom from the back forward. The benches creaked under the combined weight. Leather rustled. Someone coughed. The room smelled like old wood and floor polish, and the sharp bite of cologne that hadn't been worn in years, applied hastily in a garage bathroom at 6 in the morning. Gerald Tate entered from a side door. He moved to the state's table with the efficiency of a man who owned the room, who had stood in this room 100 times and won 100 times and expected to win again. Denise Bowman sat behind him in the gallery, her folder on her lap, her smile replaced now by something more careful, a composed, attentive expression designed for judicial observation. At exactly 8:03 a.m., Judge Sarah Hawk entered. She was 61, silver hair pulled back, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. The face of someone who had been tired for so long that exhaustion had become a permanent feature, like a scar or a birthmark. She'd been a family court judge for 22 years, and the weight of those years sat in the lines around her mouth and the way she looked at the courtroom. Not with hope, not with cynicism, but with the measured patience of someone who had seen every version of human failure and was still, against mounting evidence, willing to be surprised. She looked at the gallery. 30 men in leather stared back. "Counselor," she said, turning to Tate's attorney, a woman named Prentice, who had the sharp posture and pressed suit of someone who billed by the quarter hour. "This is a closed hearing for a minor's custody determination. Why is my courtroom full of people who appear to be a motorcycle club?" Delgado stood. "Your Honor, I'm Victor Delgado, representing the minor, Haven Morelli. The individuals in the gallery are here as proposed community guardians under an emergency guardianship petition filed with the clerk's office as of—" He checked his watch. 37 minutes ago. They have legal standing as interested parties. Judge Hawk looked at Delgado, looked at Haven, looked at the 30 men, looked back at Delgado. "You filed an emergency guardianship petition 37 minutes ago naming a motorcycle club as collective guardian. The petition names a registered community organization, the Storm Riders Community Alliance, as guardian entity, with 30 individual members serving as co-guardians under a shared custodial framework. The organizational charter, amendment documents, and supporting materials are included in the filing. Mr. Delgado, in 22 years, I have never received a petition like this. Respectfully, Your Honor, in 22 years, a child has never walked 8 miles in a November storm to find the people willing to sign it." The courtroom was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't just mean no one is talking, the kind that means everyone is holding their breath at the same time. Prentice stood. She was already shaking her head before she spoke, the way attorneys do when they want the judge to see disagreement before they articulate it. "Your Honor, the state objects in the strongest terms. This petition is procedurally improper, substantively baseless, and, frankly, absurd. The individuals in question have extensive criminal histories. They have no prior relationship with the minor. Their so-called community organization was chartered." She picked up a document and read it like it smelled bad. 4 hours ago. "This is a stunt designed to obstruct the state's lawful custody of a child who—" "Who what?" Haven said. The courtroom turned. Haven was sitting at the table beside Delgado, her hands folded in her lap, the sleeves of Marie's sweater covering her fingers. Her voice was small, but it carried. It carried the way a struck match carries in a dark room. Not loud, but visible. "Your Honor," Prentice pivoted toward the bench. "The minor should not be addressing the court directly. The minor has a name," Judge Hawk said, "and I'll hear from whoever I choose to hear from in my courtroom." She turned to Haven. "Go ahead." Haven swallowed. Her fingers tightened inside the sweater sleeves. She could feel the entire room pressing against her. 30 bikers behind her, 6 marshals somewhere outside. Gerald Tate 12 feet to her left with his expensive suit and his county badge and his smile that was exactly like Denise Bowman's smile, except more expensive. "She was going to say who ran away," Haven said. "That's what they always say. The child ran away. Like it's something I did wrong. Like leaving a courthouse hallway where nobody was watching me and nobody was coming for me and nobody cared whether I ate or slept or froze is something I should apologize for." She looked at Tate. looked directly at him for the first time. And Tate looked back, and in that exchange something passed between them that had nothing to do with law or custody or procedure. It was the recognition of predator and prey, the ancient calculation that both of them were making simultaneously, measuring each other's capacity for damage. "I didn't run away," Haven said. "I went looking for help. There's a difference." Judge Hawk studied the girl for a long moment. Then she put her glasses on, opened the petition, and began to read. The next 40 minutes were legal combat. Prentice attacked the petition from every angle: procedural deficiency, lack of established relationship, criminal backgrounds, the organizational charter's age, the absence of home study reports, the impossibility of collective guardianship under existing statute. She was thorough and sharp and absolutely relentless, and every argument she made was technically correct in the way that technical correctness can be used as a weapon against people who don't have access to the same rules. Delgado parried. He was slower, rougher, less polished than Prentice, but he had something she didn't: the 3 civilian witnesses. Marge Kessler testified that the Storm Riders had eaten at her diner every week for 15 years, tipped heavily, shoveled her sidewalk without asking, and once rebuilt her kitchen stove for free when it broke in February. Polly Orta described sharing shop space and tools, and described men who kept their word and honored their debts. Cora Blanchard, small, gray-haired, fierce behind reading glasses, presented 6 years of canceled checks showing the club's anonymous donations to her literacy program. "These men," Cora said, her voice quiet but as immovable as bedrock, "have never asked for recognition. They have never asked for gratitude. They simply showed up and did the work because children in this community needed someone to show up and do it." Prentice objected. Tate wrote notes. The clock on the wall ticked. At 9:17 a.m., Judge Hawk called a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly. Bikers filed into the hallway. Haven sat at the table with Delgado while he reorganized papers and made notes in margins and muttered things to himself that sounded like either legal strategy or quiet panic. Through the courtroom door, Haven could hear the bikers in the hallway. Low voices, boots on marble, the creak of leather as men shifted their weight and waited. Warden appeared in the doorway. He motioned to Delgado. Delgado excused himself and stepped into the hall. Haven was alone. Almost alone. Denise Bowman sat down in the chair beside her. Haven's body reacted before her mind did. She went still, the absolute practiced stillness of a child who has learned that stillness makes you invisible, and invisibility is the only armor available to someone who weighs 81 pounds. "Haven," Denise said. Her voice was soft, concerned, practiced. "I need to tell you something, and you're not going to want to hear it." Haven didn't respond. "These men," Denise continued, leaning closer. The smell of her perfume, something floral and aggressive, pushed into the air between them. "I know they seem like they care about you. I know last night must have felt like someone was finally listening, but Haven, they're using you." Haven's eyes moved to Denise, just her eyes. The rest of her was stone. "The Storm Riders are under federal investigation," Denise said. The words came out smooth, rehearsed, wrapped in the silk of professional concern. "Did they tell you that? Did their president mention that the ATF has been building a case against this club for 18 months? Racketeering, tax fraud, interstate weapons violations. This petition, this whole thing, is a publicity stunt. They're trying to rehabilitate their image before the indictments come down. You're not a child to them, Haven. You're a press release." The words landed. Haven felt them land. In her chest, in the soft place beneath her ribs where she kept the parts of herself that still believed things. She felt them land, and she felt the old mechanism activate, the one that had protected her since she was 6. The shutting down, the closing off, the retreat into the small, dark room inside her where nothing could reach her because nothing was allowed in. But something was different now. Something in the way Denise's eyes moved, the way they flicked toward the courtroom door, twice, as if checking who was watching. The way her hand had landed on Haven's arm with a pressure that was too firm to be comforting and too light to be restraining. The way her perfume smelled like it had been freshly applied, as if she'd prepared for this moment the way an actor prepares for a scene. Who told you to say this to me? Haven asked. Denise's face didn't change, but her hand tightened, 1/4 of an inch of pressure, invisible to anyone watching, but Haven felt it like a vice because she had spent 12 years calibrating her senses to detect the difference between a touch that meant safety and a touch that meant control. Nobody told me anything, Haven. I'm your caseworker. I'm trying to protect. You lost my file twice. Sweetie, you left me in a hallway for 6 hours. You put me with a family that sent me back because I didn't smile. You never visited me at the Okafor home. Not once. In 8 months. Haven's voice was level. It was the voice of someone reading a list. Inventory. Facts. Items on a receipt. And now you're sitting next to me in an empty courtroom telling me the only people who have fed me in the last 24 hours are the ones I should be afraid of. Denise pulled her hand back. The mask slipped. Not much, not all the way, but enough. Beneath the professional concern was something older and meaner, something that looked like frustration mixed with the particular anger of an adult who has been caught by a child and doesn't know how to recover. Haven, I know you're upset. I'm not upset. I'm paying attention. There's a difference. The courtroom door opened. Delgado walked in, saw Denise, and stopped. Behind him, Warden's shadow filled the doorframe. Miss Bowman, Delgado said. His voice had the temperature of January asphalt. You're speaking to my client without her counsel present. I'm going to need you to leave this table immediately. Denise stood. She smoothed her skirt. She picked up her folder. She looked at Haven one more time with an expression that was trying to be sympathetic, but was actually a warning. The look of someone who has just lost a battle and is already calculating the cost of the next one. She left. Delgado sat down. What did she say to you? Haven repeated it. All of it. The federal investigation, the ATF, the racketeering charges, the claim that the Storm Riders were using her as a press release. She repeated it with the flat precision of someone who understood that information was the only weapon available to her and accuracy was the only way to keep it sharp. Delgado listened. His face went through 3 phases: concern, confusion, fury, and settled on a 4th that was harder to read. He turned and looked at Warden in the doorway. Is any of that true? He asked. The question sat in the room like a grenade. Warden walked in, closed the door behind him. The courtroom suddenly felt smaller, the high ceilings lower, the walls closer, the air thicker. He sat down across from Delgado and Haven, and for a moment he said nothing. He just sat there, his hands on the table, the scars on his knuckles catching the overhead light, and looked at the lawyer with an expression that was not defensive, not angry, but weary in the way that only the truth makes people weary. 18 months ago, Warden said, the ATF opened an investigation into a weapons trafficking ring operating out of Ridgeton's industrial district. 3 of our members were initially flagged because they work in shops near the suspected locations. The investigation found nothing. No charges were filed, no indictments were issued. The case was closed 9 months ago. He paused. I have the closure letter in a safe at the clubhouse. Then why is she saying, because a closed investigation still has a file, and a file can be waved around in a courtroom to make 30 men look like criminals whether the charges stuck or not. Warden looked at Haven. She wasn't lying to you. She was telling you a version of the truth that leaves out the part where we were cleared. That's worse than lying. That's architecture. Haven stared at him. Architecture. She turned the word over in her head. It fit. It fit perfectly. Her entire life had been built by architects, people who designed the structures she lived in, the pathways she walked, the walls that closed around her. Every foster home, every caseworker, every courthouse hallway had been someone's blueprint, and she had been the material they built with, shaped and placed and discarded according to plans she was never allowed to see. The closure letter, Delgado said. Can you get it? It's 20 minutes away. We don't have 20 minutes. Recess ends in... He checked the clock. 8. Warden pulled out his phone. Dialed. Waited. Marie. The safe into the basement. Brown envelope, top shelf, marked ATF-Ridgeton. I need you to bring it to the courthouse. Now. He paused. I know. Please. He hung up. Delgado ran both hands through his hair. It was already a mess, and the gesture made it worse. Even with the closure letter, they'll argue it shows a pattern of association. It's not proof of guilt, but it's not a clean slate either. None of us has a clean slate, Warden said. That's not what we're offering. We're offering a floor. A place for this kid to stand, dirty, cracked, imperfect. But a floor. Haven looked down at the table. Her reflection stared back from the polished wood surface. Distorted, dark, a 12-year-old girl wearing someone else's clothes sitting in a courtroom built for adults, who had spent her entire life deciding what to do with her, as if she were a piece of furniture that needed a room. "Mr. Delgado," she said. "Yeah?" "I want to testify." "You already spoke." "I want to testify, not just answer a question. I want to stand up and talk and make the judge hear me. Not the version of me that Denise tells her about. Not the version in my file, me." Delgado looked at Warden. Warden looked at Haven. The girl's eyes were dark and steady and ancient. The eyes of someone who had learned things at 12 that some people don't learn in a lifetime, and the weight of that education sat in her gaze like a stone at the bottom of a well. "If you testify," Delgado said carefully, "Prentice will cross-examine you. She will ask about every placement, every home, every time you ran. She'll make it sound like the instability was yours, not the system's. She'll use your own history against you." "My history is all I have," Haven said. "Let her use it. I know it better than she does." The recess ended. Judge Hawk returned. The courtroom refilled. Bikers in the gallery. Prentice at the state's table. Tate behind her with his folder and his badge. Denise Bowman sat in the back row, and Haven could feel her eyes on the back of her neck like a finger pressing against her spine. Delgado stood. "Your Honor, the petitioners request that the minor be permitted to give testimony regarding her preference for guardianship placement." Prentice objected. "The minor's preferences, while noted, are not determinative in custody." "Overruled," Judge Hawk said. "I'll hear the child." Haven stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. The sound was sharp and small, and it bounced off the courtroom walls and came back to her ears like an echo of all the other chairs she'd sat in and stood up from and left behind. She walked to the witness stand, sat down. The chair was too big for her. The microphone was too high. She adjusted it with both hands, and the feedback squealed briefly through the speakers and made everyone wince. And for a half second, the absurdity of it. This tiny girl in an oversized sweater fighting a microphone in a room full of adults who controlled her fate was so stark that it cut through the legal tension like something breaking through ice. "State your name for the record," Delgado said. "Haven Morelli." "Haven, can you tell the court why you left the courthouse last night?" She didn't look at Delgado. She looked at Judge Hawk, directly at her, eye to eye. "Because nobody was coming," she said. "I sat on a bench in the second-floor hallway for 3 hours. Nobody checked on me. Nobody brought me water. Nobody told me what was going to happen to me. I could hear people behind a door talking about my case like I was a problem they were trying to get rid of before the end of their shift." She paused. "Not for drama, for breath. I've been in the system since I was 6, 7 foster homes, 2 group homes. I've had 4 caseworkers. The current one lost my file twice. She's sitting in the back of this room right now." Every head turned toward Denise Bowman. Denise's face went rigid. "I stole a guardianship form from the clerk's desk because nobody was going to give me one. I walked 8 miles in the rain because I didn't have bus money and nobody was going to drive me. I walked to the storm rider's garage because my mother told me to when I was 6 years old, and my mother was a lot of things. She was an addict and she left me and she died. But she never lied to me. Not once." The courtroom was still. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a car horn honked, and the sound came through the walls, distant and unreal, like a transmission from another world where people did normal things like honk at traffic. "They fed me," Haven said. "They gave me a towel. They gave me coffee. They called a lawyer. They signed a piece of paper. 30 men signed a piece of paper saying they would be responsible for me. I've been alive for 12 years, and nobody has ever signed anything for me except to send me somewhere else." She looked at Tate, the man with the county badge, the man who traded children like inventory. He was writing on his notepad, but his pen had stopped moving 2 sentences ago, and the stillness of his hand was the only tell he had. "I don't know if these men are perfect," Haven said. "I don't think they're perfect. I think they're loud and they smell like engine oil, and they made me toast that was burned on one side and barely cooked on the other, and their coffee is the worst thing I've ever tasted." A sound moved through the gallery. Not laughter, not quite, but the exhale of 30 men releasing something they'd been holding since she started speaking. "But they chose me. I walked into their garage and they chose me. And I'm asking you, I'm asking this court to let me choose them back." Judge Hawk removed her glasses. She set them on the bench in front of her and pressed both hands flat on the surface, the way Warden pressed his hands on tables. The posture of someone trying to hold themselves steady while the ground shifts. Prentice stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine." The courtroom door opened. Everyone turned. A marshal stood in the doorway, and beside him was a woman Haven didn't recognize, middle-aged, wearing a wrinkled blazer, carrying a box of documents that looked like they weighed as much as she did. She was breathing hard. Her hair was disheveled. She looked like someone who had driven very fast to get here and wasn't entirely sure she should have come. "Your Honor," the woman said from the doorway, "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Karen Aldridge. I'm a senior auditor with the State Inspector General's office. I have an emergency disclosure that is directly relevant to this proceeding." Tate's pen fell. It hit the table and rolled to the edge and dropped to the floor, and nobody picked it up. Judge Hawk looked at Aldridge. "This is a closed custody hearing. You can't simply walk in and, Your Honor, I was contacted at 5:30 this morning by an anonymous source within the county's Child Protective Division. The information I've received and the documentation I'm carrying suggests that the minor in this case, Haven Morelli, has been systematically misclassified in the state's custody system for the purpose of channeling her into a private institutional facility with which the county maintains a per capita financial contract." The room went cold. Not figuratively. The heating system in the courthouse had been struggling all morning, and it chose this exact moment to cycle off, and the temperature dropped 3 degrees in 10 seconds, and every person in the room felt it. The convergence of physical cold and the freezing realization of what had just been said. "Specifically," Aldridge continued, stepping into the courtroom, "the documentation indicates that Haven Morelli's foster placements were deliberately destabilized by her assigned caseworker through delayed paperwork, incompatible family matching, and failure to provide mandated support services, in order to generate a pattern of placement failure that would justify permanent institutional commitment. The receiving institution, Ridgemont Youth Services, receives $47,000 per year per child from the county. The caseworker in question has facilitated the transfer of 11 children to this facility in the past 3 years. All 11 were subsequently reclassified as long-term institutional residents with no pathway to foster or family placement." Haven heard the words. She heard them the way you hear a detonation from a distance. The sound arrives after the light, and by the time your ears register what happened, the damage is already done. She looked at Denise Bowman. Denise was standing. Her folder was on the floor. Papers had spilled across the gallery bench like white leaves from a dead tree. 11 children. Not one. Not Haven. 11. 11 children systematically destroyed, their placements sabotaged, their files manipulated, their chances of family or stability dismantled piece by piece, so that a bureaucrat with a county badge could fill beds in a private facility and someone could collect $47,000 per child per year. Haven felt the floor tilt beneath her, not physically, something deeper, some foundational understanding of the world that she'd carried her entire life. The belief that the system was broken but not malicious, neglectful but not predatory, failing but not designed to fail, cracked along a fault line she hadn't known existed and began to slide. "Your Honor," Tate was standing now. His chair had been pushed back. His face had undergone a transformation that was almost mechanical. The composed authority replaced by something tighter, something that pulled at the corners of his mouth and narrowed his eyes. "This is an ambush. This woman has no standing to present unverified documentation in a closed proceeding." "Sit down, Mr. Tate," Judge Hawk said. Her voice had changed. Throughout the morning, the judge had been measured, careful, professionally neutral. Now her voice carried something that wasn't neutrality. It was the specific, controlled fury of a woman who had spent 22 years in family court, believing that the system she served was flawed, but fundamentally aimed at protecting children, and who had just heard evidence suggesting that someone had turned it into a machine for selling them. Tate didn't sit. "I said sit down." He sat. Aldridge placed the box on the state's table. She opened it and began removing documents, spreadsheets, internal memos, placement records, financial statements. Each document landed on the table with a sound that was impossibly quiet for the weight it carried. "These records show," Aldridge said, "that Gerald Tate, Deputy Director of the county's Child Protective Division, personally approved every one of the 11 transfers to Ridgemont Youth Services. They also show that Denise Bowman, caseworker of record for 9 of those 11 cases, received performance bonuses tied to successful institutional placements. The bonuses were funded by Ridgemont's parent company, Ariston Holdings, through a consulting arrangement with the county that was not disclosed in any of the placement proceedings." Haven looked at Denise. Denise looked at Haven. And in that exchange, the last piece of architecture collapsed. The careful structure of ignorance and assumption and survival that Haven had built around herself since she was 6 years old. The belief that the people who moved her from place to place were at least trying, even if they failed, even if they forgot, even if they lost her file twice, fell inward like a building demolished from within. She saw Denise clearly for the first time. Not a caseworker who was bad at her job. A woman who was very, very good at a different job entirely. "Your Honor." Delgado's voice cut through the silence. He was standing. His hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something that looked like rage compressed into the smallest possible space. "In light of this disclosure, I am requesting an immediate emergency stay of the state's custody order and full judicial review of the minor's case history. I am also requesting that Gerald Tate and Denise Bowman be excluded from any further proceedings related to Haven Morelli, and that the court consider emergency protective placement with the petitioning guardians pending investigation." Prentice stood. Her face was white. She looked at Tate. Tate wasn't looking at anyone. He was staring at the documents on the table in front of him, the way a man stares at the ground opening beneath his feet. "Ms. Prentice," Judge Hawk said, "does the state wish to respond?" Prentice opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "The state requests a recess to evaluate the new evidence." Denied. "I've been sitting in this courtroom for 2 hours watching the state argue that 30 men with criminal records are too dangerous to raise a child, while the state's own employees were apparently running a pipeline that sold children to a private facility for profit." Judge Hawk's voice was quiet. It was the quietest it had been all morning. That was what made it terrifying. "We are not taking a recess. We are going to resolve this right now." She turned to Haven. The girl was still sitting in the witness chair. Too big sweater, hands hidden in the sleeves, eyes that had seen something break inside the world and were still processing the shape of the wreckage. "Haven," the judge said. Her voice changed again. Softer now. Not the softness of pity, the softness of recognition. One exhausted woman looking at one exhausted girl across a distance that was measured not in feet, but in years and failures, and a system that had betrayed them both. "I need you to tell me one more time. Are you certain about these men?" Haven looked at the gallery. 30 faces looked back. Scarred, tired, imperfect, beautiful in the way that broken things become beautiful when they choose to hold something fragile instead of dropping it. Warden sat in the front row. His hands were on his knees. His eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them. He didn't look away. He just sat there and let a 12-year-old girl see the one thing he had never shown anyone in 30 years of building walls. The fact that behind the leather and the scars and the concrete and the engine noise, there was a man who was afraid. Afraid of failing her. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid that the world had broken her so thoroughly that nothing he could offer would be strong enough to hold the pieces. "I'm certain," Haven said. And the courtroom door opened again, and Marie McCall walked in holding a brown envelope and looking like a woman who had broken every traffic law in the county to get here. And behind her, in the hallway, Haven could see something that made her breath stop. A line of people. Not bikers. Not lawyers. Not marshals. Citizens. Neighbors. Strangers. People who had heard the motorcycles this morning. People who had seen the column ride through downtown. People who had somehow learned what was happening in courtroom 3B and had come to stand in a marble hallway and wait, because sometimes the world breaks in a direction that makes people want to show up. Judge Hawk looked at the line in the hallway, looked at the gallery, looked at the documents on the table, looked at Gerald Tate, who had stopped looking at anything. She picked up her gavel. And Haven Morelli, sitting in a witness chair that was too big for her, wearing a dead nurse's daughter's sweater that smelled like laundry detergent and something floral, gripped the armrests and waited for the sound that would either give her a family or take away the last one she'd ever have the courage to ask for. The gavel didn't fall. Judge Hawk held it 6 inches above the bench, suspended, frozen, the way a trigger is held between the decision and the consequence. And then she set it down without striking. The sound it didn't make was louder than the sound it would have. "This court," she said, "is not prepared to rule." The words landed in Haven's chest like a physical blow. She felt them impact somewhere behind her sternum, in the place where she'd been building something fragile and temporary over the last 12 hours. Not hope exactly, but the scaffolding for hope, the architecture of maybe, the first tentative framework of a world where someone chose her and the choice held, not prepared to rule. "Your Honor," Delgado started. "Mr. Delgado, sit down." Judge Hawk's voice was steel-wrapped in exhaustion. "I have a 12-year-old minor in my courtroom. I have a guardianship petition unlike anything in the legal history of this state. I have an Inspector General's auditor who just delivered evidence of systemic fraud in my own county's child protective system. I have a deputy director sitting at the state's table who may be the subject of a criminal investigation before this day is over. And I have 30 men in my gallery who rode through a November storm because a dead woman's daughter knocked on their door." She paused, removed her glasses, set them on the bench with a precision that suggested her hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. "I'm not going to make a decision of this magnitude in the next 60 seconds. What I'm going to do is this." She looked at Tate. The man hadn't moved since Aldridge's disclosure. He sat at the state's table like someone who had been turned to stone mid-thought, his pen on the floor, his notepad open to a page of notes that no longer mattered. "Mr. Tate, you are hereby recused from any involvement in this case or any case involving a minor in this county, effective immediately. If you attempt to contact the minor, her representatives, or any party to this proceeding, I will hold you in contempt and refer the matter to the district attorney's office." Tate's jaw moved. No sound came out. "Miss Bowman." Judge Hawk turned to the gallery. Denise was standing near the back row, clutching her folder against her chest like a shield. "The same applies to you. You are suspended from all casework pending investigation. Surrender your county credentials to the bailiff before you leave this building." Denise's face collapsed, not into tears, into something drier and more mechanical, the disassembly of a mask that had been maintained for so long its removal left nothing recognizable underneath. She looked at Haven one last time. Haven looked back. Neither of them blinked. "Regarding the minor," Judge Hawk continued, "I am granting a 72-hour emergency protective order placing Haven Morelli in the temporary custody of the Storm Riders Community Alliance, pending a full evidentiary hearing on the guardianship petition. During this period, a court-appointed social worker, not from Mr. Tate's department, will conduct a home evaluation and welfare check. Mr. Delgado, your clients will comply fully." "Without question, Your Honor." "This hearing is adjourned until Thursday at 9 a.m. And Mr. Delgado?" She looked at him over the bench. "Those 30 men better be on their absolute best behavior for the next 72 hours. Because I am giving them the benefit of a doubt I have not given anyone in 22 years, and if they waste it, I will not give it again." The gavel fell. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot, and then there was motion, the kind of sudden, chaotic, released pressure motion that happens when a room full of people who've been holding their breath for 2 hours finally exhale at the same time. Bikers stood, benches creaked, voices erupted in the hallway. Delgado grabbed Haven's shoulder and squeezed once. Hard, brief, the grip of a man who didn't trust himself to speak. Haven sat in the witness chair and felt the world tilt and resettle beneath her, the way the earth feels after a tremor. The same ground, the same gravity, but everything has shifted 3 inches to the left and nothing lines up the way it did before. 72 hours. Not a victory. A window. A crack in the wall just wide enough to see light through. And if anyone on either side made a single mistake in the next 3 days, the wall would close and the light would disappear, and Haven Morelli would become the 12th name on Gerald Tate's ledger. Warden reached the witness stand. He didn't say anything. He extended his hand, palm up, open, scarred across the lifeline. Haven looked at it. She looked at the hand of a man who had killed people in a war she couldn't pronounce, and rebuilt engines in a garage she'd walked into 12 hours ago, and signed a piece of paper that said he would be responsible for her. And she placed her hand in his, and it disappeared inside his grip, the way a stone disappears inside a fist. They walked out of the courtroom together. The hallway was chaos. The line of citizens that Marie had walked through was still there, longer now, spilling out the courthouse doors and down the marble steps. Someone had called a reporter. A camera crew from a local station was setting up outside, and a woman with a microphone was trying to get statements from bikers who responded with silence and leather and the kind of stare that makes reporters reconsider their career choices. Warden pushed through the crowd with Haven beside him. Colt and Roach flanked. The formation reformed around them. Instinctive, automatic, the way a school of fish reforms around its center when a predator passes through. Outside, the air was cold and clean and smelled like rain that had recently stopped. The motorcycles waited at the curb, chrome catching the gray morning light. Haven breathed. The cold air filled her lungs, and it felt different now. Not the punishing, hostile cold of last night's 8-mile walk, but something sharper, something that felt like the first breath after being underwater. "Warden," Roach's voice, low, tight. He was standing at the edge of the steps, looking at the parking lot across the street. Warden followed his gaze. A black SUV sat in the far corner of the lot. Engine running, windows tinted, no plates. "It was there when we arrived," Roach said. "Hasn't moved. Could be press." "Press doesn't remove plates." Warden stared at the SUV. The vehicle stared back with the blank, dark patience of something that had nowhere to go and all the time in the world. He turned to Colt. "Get her in the van. Now!" Colt moved. Haven was in the van with Delgado before she fully understood why, and the door slid shut and the engine started, and through the tinted rear window she watched Warden standing on the courthouse steps, watching the black SUV, his hands at his sides, his body absolutely still in a way that wasn't calm, but was something beyond calm. The focused, deliberate stillness of a man whose training had taught him that the moment before violence is the moment you need to be the most quiet. The SUV pulled away, slowly, deliberately. It turned left on Main Street and disappeared behind the courthouse, and Warden watched it go and didn't move until it was gone, and then stood there for another 10 seconds watching the space where it had been. The convoy rolled through Ridgeton in formation. 30 motorcycles, 1 van. The sound shook windows and turned heads and drew people to their porches and storefronts, and Haven sat in the back of the van with her knees pulled to her chest and watched the city pass through the window and tried to understand what had just happened and what was going to happen next, and what the black SUV meant, and why Warden's stillness on the courthouse steps had frightened her more than anything Denise Bowman had said. They reached the clubhouse at 10:47 a.m. The garage looked different in daylight, smaller, older. The cinder block walls were stained with decades of weather, and the corrugated roof had patches of rust that looked like wounds, and the neon sign above the bay door was off now, and without its light, the words Storm Riders, MC looked faded and tired, like a tattoo on aging skin. But inside, the garage was warm. Someone had turned on the space heaters. The coffee was fresh. The table where Haven had sat 12 hours ago had been cleared and cleaned, and there was a plate of sandwiches that looked like they'd been made by men who understood the structural principles of sandwiches, but not the aesthetic ones. Marie McCall was waiting. She was standing by the back door with her coat still on and her car keys still in her hand, and the brown envelope that contained the ATF closure letter pressed against her ribs. She was 51 and looked it, not in a way that suggested age, but in a way that suggested survival, The kind of face that has been through something that permanently rearranges the relationship between a person and their reflection. She had sharp blue eyes and gray-streaked hair pulled into a ponytail, and hands that were strong from years of physical therapy after chemo, left her muscles wasted and her determination intact. She saw Haven. Haven saw her. Neither of them moved for a moment. The moment stretched. It stretched past the point of comfort and into something that felt like a negotiation being conducted without words. Two people deciding simultaneously how close to let the other one come. Marie walked to her, stopped 3 feet away, close enough to touch, far enough to breathe. "You look like her," Marie said. "Around the eyes." Haven didn't respond. She was staring at Marie the way she stared at every new adult, measuring exits, calculating threats, determining the parameters of this person's patience before the inevitable moment when patience ran out and Haven became someone else's problem. Marie saw the calculation happening. She recognized it because she'd seen it in the mirror as not the same formula, but the same algebra. The math of someone who has learned to expect damage and calibrate their vulnerability accordingly. "I'm not going to hug you," Marie said. "I figure you've had enough people grabbing at you for one morning. But I'm going to sit in this room and eat one of these terrible sandwiches, and if you want to sit next to me, you can. And if you don't, you can sit somewhere else, and that's fine too." Marie sat down, picked up a sandwich, took a bite, made a face that suggested the sandwich was exactly as bad as it looked. Haven stood for another few seconds. Then she sat down, not next to Marie, one chair away, close enough to share a table, far enough to maintain the space that kept her safe. Marie didn't comment on the distance. She just ate her sandwich and let the silence be silence. Outside, the storm was building again. The brief clearing that had opened during the morning hearing was closing like a wound, and clouds stacked up over Ridgeton in layers of gray and black that turned the noon sky into something that looked like dusk. The temperature dropped. Wind picked up. The garage doors rattled in their frames. At 1:15 p.m., Roach called an emergency meeting. Not in the main garage. In the back room, a windowless concrete box that served as the club's chapel, their war room, the place where decisions were made that couldn't be unmade. The room had a single table, a single overhead light, and walls that had absorbed enough cigarette smoke over the decades to turn the concrete from gray to yellow. Roach stood at one end. Warden sat at the other. Between them, a laptop showed a series of documents that Roach had spent the last 3 hours acquiring through channels he would never describe to anyone outside this room. The door was closed. Haven was in the main garage with Marie and Decker. Only officers were present: Warden, Roach, Colt, Nails, and Grease. "Here's what we're dealing with," Roach said. He tapped the laptop screen. A spreadsheet filled with numbers and names glowed in the dim light. Ariston Holdings, the parent company of Ridgemont Youth Services, is not a local operation. They run private juvenile facilities in 9 states. 17 facilities total. Combined annual revenue from state contracts exceeds $40 million. The numbers sat in the room. "Tate is not the top of this thing," Roach continued. "He's a branch manager, a regional operator. The person running Ariston Holdings is a man named Victor Lassiter. He's based out of state. Never visits the facilities. Never meets the children. He built this company on a single principle. Children who enter the foster system and fail repeatedly become eligible for institutional placement, and institutional placement generates per capita revenue from state contracts. The more children who fail, the more money Ariston makes." "Engineered failure," Warden said. "Exactly. Caseworkers like Bowman are placed in CPS offices with a specific mandate, so to destabilize placements, generate failure records, build justification for institutional transfer. Tate approves the transfers. Ariston collects the revenue. Everyone gets paid." Colt was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. His face had gone a color that wasn't quite red and wasn't quite white, but was the specific shade that happens when rage and nausea occupy the same body at the same time. "How many kids?" "Based on the documents Aldridge showed in court, at least 11 in this county. But if you scale the model to all 17 facilities across 9 states, Roach paused. The pause was heavy with the weight of the number he was about to say. "We're looking at potentially hundreds." The room didn't react. Not visibly, Not the way rooms react in movies. No one pounded the table, no one shouted, no one threw a chair. These were men who had been trained by war and poverty and years of being told they didn't matter to absorb impact without displaying it. The reaction happened internally. A collective tightening, a shared contraction, the silent compression of 30 years of combined damage into a single point of focused, white-hot clarity. The 72-hour window, Warden said. It's not about the home evaluation. No. Roach closed the laptop. It's about time. Tate knows what Aldridge has. He knows the investigation is coming. And he knows that if Haven testifies at Thursday's hearing with specific details about how Bowman sabotaged her placements, it corroborates the auditor's findings and blows the entire network open, every county, every facility, every caseworker on Ariston's payroll. So Tate needs Haven to not testify. Tate needs Haven to disappear. The way the other 11 disappeared, into a facility, into the system, into a file that nobody opens. If she's in Ridgemont by Thursday, there is no hearing. The petition dies, the investigation stalls, and Ariston's lawyers bury the audit in procedural challenges for the next 5 years. Warden's hands were flat on the table. His knuckles were white. The scars on his fingers stood out like ridges on a topographic map of violence and repair. The black SUV, he said. I ran partial descriptions from 3 different angles. A contact at a private security firm confirmed it matches vehicles used by Greyline Solutions, a private security company that handles facility transfers for Ariston Holdings. Facility transfers. The polite term. They pick up children from courthouses and detention centers and transport them to Ariston facilities. They're bonded, insured, and licensed by the state. It's all legal. On paper. And off paper? Roach looked at him. Off paper, they're the people who come in the night and take kids who can't fight back. And nobody asks questions because the paperwork is clean and the children don't have anyone who cares enough to check. The overhead light buzzed. The sound was identical to the fluorescent light in the courthouse hallway where Haven had sat 12 hours ago, and for a moment the two sounds, separated by miles and hours and everything that had happened in between, merged into a single frequency that hummed with the specific, relentless indifference of systems that process people like material. They'll come tonight, Warden said. They'll come tonight, Roach confirmed. Then we need to not be here tonight. Warden stood. He walked to the door. Opened it. The main garage was visible. Haven sitting at the table with Marie, eating a sandwich, her feet not touching the floor. Decker sitting 3 feet away pretending to read a motorcycle magazine, but actually watching every entrance and exit with the peripheral awareness of someone who'd spent his childhood learning that doors opening meant danger. Warden watched her for a moment. The girl who had walked 8 miles in a storm. The girl who had stood in a courtroom and spoken with a steadiness that men twice her age couldn't manage. The girl who was sitting in his garage eating a sandwich that was too thick on one side and barely there on the other. And the girl had no idea that she was the linchpin, the single small body around which an entire network of corruption was now rotating, the one witness whose testimony could collapse a machine that had been grinding children into revenue for years. He closed the door. Here's what happens, Warden said. We split. 2 groups. The main body stays here. Lights on, engines running. Make it look like the full club is present. Roach, you run that crew. Anyone who shows up, marshals, Greyline, whoever, you're 30 bikers having a Tuesday night. Haven isn't here. You don't know where she is. You lawyer up and stall. And the second group? Me, Colt, Decker, Marie, Haven, Delgado if he'll come. We go to the safe house on Route 9. The cabin? Nobody outside this room knows about it. It's off the grid, off the books, and 30 miles from anyone who wants to find us. Roach studied him. You're taking the kid into hiding. I'm taking the kid somewhere she can sleep for 2 nights without someone trying to erase her before she can testify. And if they find you... Warden didn't answer. He didn't need to. Every man in that room knew what the silence meant. It meant the same thing silence always means between men who have been in situations where the only answer to what if they find you is a willingness to make the finding cost more than the searchers are willing to pay. I need one more thing, Warden said. He looked at Nails. The documents Aldridge brought to court. She's got copies. But we need originals. Financial records. Transfer orders. The consulting agreement between Ariston and the county. If something happens to Aldridge's copies before Thursday, we need a second set. Where would originals be? Tate's office, county building, third floor? Nails looked at him. You want me to break into a county office? I want you to visit a public building during business hours and exercise your right as a tax-paying citizen to request public records. That's not what you want. That's what you'll tell the lawyer if it goes wrong. Nails almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that happens between men who have been doing difficult things together for so long that the absurdity has become its own language. Go, Warden said. And Nails, if you get caught, you've never heard of Haven Morelli. You were looking for your tax records. You got lost. I always get lost. At 3:45 p.m., Warden pulled Haven aside. They stood in the back hallway, the same hallway where he'd taken Marie's call hours earlier, the same cold cinder block walls, the same smell of old paint and winter seeping through the mortar. The light was a single bare bulb. It threw sharp shadows that made Warden's face look carved from something geological. We're leaving, he said. You, me, Colt, Decker, Marie. Leaving where? A place I own outside the city. Small, quiet. Nobody knows about it. Haven's eyes narrowed. The calculation was instant. The same calculation she performed with every new environment, every new set of walls, every new assurance from an adult who might or might not be telling the truth. Why? Warden looked at her. He could have lied. He could have softened it. He could have told her they were going on a trip, going somewhere nice, going to rest before the hearing. He could have protected her the way adults always protected her, by removing information and calling it safety. He didn't. Because the people who are profiting from putting you in an institution know that you're the one person who can bring their operation down, and they're going to try to take you before Thursday, tonight. Probably late. Probably quiet. The kind of quiet that nobody hears and nobody reports, and nobody investigates because the paperwork will say you were transferred through proper channels, and by the time anyone checks, you'll be inside a facility with locked doors and no phone. Haven absorbed this the way she absorbed everything, silently, completely, with the specific metabolic efficiency of a child who had been processing threats since before she could read. Okay, she said. Okay. You're telling me the truth. That's more than anyone's given me in 6 years. If you say we need to go, we go. Warden looked at this girl. 12 years old, 81 pounds, standing in a cinder block hallway, being told that powerful people wanted to disappear her, and her response was okay. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had long ago stopped being a reason to hesitate and had become simply the weather she lived in, constant and irrelevant, something you dressed for and walked through. Get your backpack, he said. At 4:22 p.m., as the early November dark was already swallowing the streets, a truck pulled out of the back of the Storm Riders compound. Not a motorcycle, not the van. A battered Ford F-250 with mud on the fenders and a camper shell over the bed. Warden drove. Marie sat beside him. Haven sat in the back seat between Colt and Decker, her backpack on her lap, the guardianship form inside it signed by 30 men whose names she was still learning. They took back roads. No highway, no main streets. Warden drove the way he did everything, deliberately, with an awareness of the environment that bordered on the mechanical. He checked mirrors every 8 seconds. He noted every vehicle behind them. He took turns that weren't on any GPS route because the roads they followed were the kind that existed on county maps but not on digital ones. Gravel tracks and farm roads and the forgotten connective tissue between places that the modern world had decided weren't worth navigating. Haven watched the landscape change. The industrial district gave way to residential blocks, then to commercial strips, then to the thinning edge of the city where buildings became sparse and fields opened up and the sky grew wider and emptier above them. The November dark came fast out here. The last light bled from the western horizon in a thin orange line that looked like a wound closing, and then it was dark and the truck's headlights cut 2 tunnels through the nothing, and the road stretched ahead like a sentence that hadn't found its ending. Nobody spoke. The heater hummed, the engine rumbled. Marie's hand rested on the center console between the seats, and at some point during the drive, Haven couldn't say when, couldn't identify the exact moment. Warden's hand moved from the gear shift and covered Marie's, and the two of them sat there in the front seat holding hands in the dark, the way people hold on to things that are too important to let go of and too fragile to grip too tightly. Haven watched their hands. She watched the way Warden's scarred fingers interlaced with Marie's smaller ones, the way neither of them looked at each other, the way the gesture was so practiced and so unconscious that it was clearly something they'd done 1,000 times, in hospital rooms, in waiting rooms, in the dark of their own house in the middle of the night, when the fear was too big to hold alone. Something moved in Haven's chest, not the scaffolding of hope, something quieter, something that didn't have a name because she'd never felt it before and didn't have a category to file it in. It sat beneath her ribs like a warm stone, and she didn't touch it, didn't examine it, just let it be there. The cabin appeared at 5:38 p.m., a small structure set back from the road at the end of a dirt track, surrounded by bare oaks and the skeletal remains of a garden that Marie had planted years ago and nature had reclaimed. One story. Wood siding. A porch with 2 chairs that had been rained on enough times to turn gray. A chimney. A padlocked door. Warden killed the engine. The silence that replaced it was enormous. Not the silence of the city, which is always threaded with distant traffic and voices and the hum of infrastructure, but the silence of open land, of fields and trees and cold air with nothing in it but itself. He unlocked the cabin. Went inside first. Checked every room. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom with a cracked mirror, a living room with a wood stove and furniture covered in sheets. He pulled the sheets off, opened the flue, started a fire with wood that had been stacked beside the stove since last winter. The cabin warmed slowly. The fire crackled. The wood popped. Marie found blankets in a closet and made up the beds with the efficient, unsentimental competence of a woman who had spent 2 rounds of chemo in hospitals and had learned that the fastest way to make a place feel habitable is to make the beds. Haven stood in the center of the living room. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the space, the wood stove, the small kitchen, the window that looked out onto bare trees and a darkening sky. It was the smallest house she'd ever been in. It was also the first one that felt like it had been built by someone who wanted to be there, not someone who was paid to put a roof over heads that nobody claimed. "Your room's the one on the left," Marie said, passing through with an armload of blankets. "There's an extra quilt in the closet if you get cold." "My room?" "For the next 2 nights. Yours." Haven looked at the door to the left bedroom. The word yours echoed in a space inside her that had never been assigned a possessive pronoun. Your room, your bed, your quilt. Language that implied belonging. Language that people used when they expected you to still be there in the morning. She went into the room, sat on the bed. The mattress sagged in the middle and the quilt smelled like cedar, and the window was small and looked out onto nothing but trees and darkness. She put her backpack on the floor beside the bed. She didn't open it. She didn't take anything out. She just sat there and listened to the sounds of the cabin filling up around her. Warden's boots on the kitchen floor, Marie running water, Colt checking the perimeter outside. Decker positioning himself by the front door with the same quiet, watchful stillness he'd maintained in the garage. For the first time in 6 years, Haven Morelli was in a room that nobody could walk into without passing through people who had chosen to stand between her and the door. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders and breathed. At 9:17 p.m., Warden's phone rang. He was standing on the porch in the dark, watching the tree line, his breath coming out in clouds that the night dissolved. The phone's screen lit his face blue. He answered. "Roach." Roach's voice was tight, compressed. The voice of a man delivering information under conditions that require every word to carry maximum weight in minimum time. "They came. 40 minutes ago. 2 SUVs. Gray line plates. 4 men. Professional. They had paperwork. A transfer order signed by a substitute judge out of the county's emergency night court. Tate's name wasn't on it. Bowman's name wasn't on it. Somebody new. Somebody we haven't seen before." "What did you do?" "What you told me to do. 30 bikers having a Tuesday night. Haven who? Don't know her. Never heard of her. They searched the clubhouse. They searched the garage. They searched every vehicle. Nothing. They searched without a warrant? They had the transfer order, claimed it gave them authority to recover a minor in immediate danger. Delgado will fight it Thursday, but tonight it was enough. They went through everything, Trace. Everything. Warden gripped the porch railing. The wood was cold and rough under his hand, and he squeezed until the grain pressed into his palm like a brand. "There's more," Roach said. "Tell me." Nails went to the county building, 3rd floor, Tate's office. "And?" A pause. The pause lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds is nothing in normal conversation. 3 seconds after the words, "Nails went to Tate's office," is a lifetime. The office was empty. Not empty as in Tate wasn't there. Empty as in cleaned out, desk cleared, filing cabinets open and bare, computer removed. The entire office was stripped sometime between the hearing this morning and 5 p.m. today. Every document, every hard drive, every trace of anything that connects Gerald Tate to Ariston Holdings is gone. The cold hit Warden differently now. Not from outside, from inside. The kind of cold that starts in the center of your chest and radiates outward like frost, forming on the inside of a window. "They're destroying evidence," Warden said. "They're doing more than that. I ran Tate's name through every public database I could access. As of 6 p.m. today, Gerald Tate is no longer listed as an employee of the county's Child Protective Division. His personnel file has been flagged as sealed. His county email has been deactivated. His phone number is disconnected." Roach's voice dropped to something barely audible. "He's being erased, Trace, the same way they erase the kids. Paperwork disappears, person disappears, and by the time anyone looks for answers, there's nothing left to find." Warden turned and looked through the cabin window. In the living room, the fire glowed. Marie sat in a chair reading something. Decker was by the door. And in the left bedroom, visible through the half-open door, Haven was lying on the bed with the quilt pulled to her chin, staring at the ceiling, awake and motionless and listening to the silence the way a soldier listens to the dark. "If they destroy enough evidence before Thursday," Roach said, "the audit falls apart. Aldridge's disclosure gets challenged as unsubstantiated. The petition gets denied on grounds that the circumstances have changed, and Haven goes into the system with a target on her back and nobody left to fight for her. That's not going to happen. Then we need those originals. And Tate's office is a dead end." Warden closed his eyes. Behind his lids, in the darkness of his own skull, he saw the spreadsheet from Roach's laptop. 9 states, 17 facilities, hundreds of children processed through a machine designed to profit from their failure. He saw Rebecca Morelli sitting on a hospital bathroom floor holding Marie's hand. He saw Haven walking 8 miles through freezing rain. He saw 30 signatures crammed into a space designed for one. "There's another way," Warden said. "The original records wouldn't only exist in Tate's office. They'd exist at Ariston's corporate level. Contracts, financial agreements, transfer authorizations. They can destroy the county copies, but they can't destroy the corporate originals without alerting their own board and their own auditors. You want to go after Ariston directly? I want Aldridge to go after Ariston directly. She's a state auditor. She has subpoena authority. If we give her probable cause, if we give her enough to convince a judge to sign an emergency preservation order, Ariston's servers get frozen before they can wipe them. And probable cause comes from what? From Haven." Warden's voice was quiet now, the quietest it had been since this started. "She was in the system for 6 years. Every placement, every transfer, every failed home, it's all in her memory. If we can match her testimony to the pattern Aldridge identified, dates, names, the specific ways Bowman sabotaged each placement, that's corroboration. That's enough. You're asking a 12-year-old to reconstruct 6 years of systemic abuse from memory. I'm asking a 12-year-old to do what she's been doing her entire life, survive by paying attention." The line was quiet. The wind moved through the trees around the cabin. An owl called somewhere in the dark. 2 notes, low and hollow, the sound of something hunting. "I'll call Aldridge," Roach said. "Get her to the cabin by morning. And Trace?" "Yeah." "The substitute judge who signed that transfer order tonight. The one whose name we don't recognize." "What about them?" "I found the name. Judge Raymond Cross. Appointed to the county's emergency night court roster 6 months ago. I looked up his financial disclosures. He owns stock in a company called Meridian Capital Partners." Roach paused. Meridian Capital Partners is the majority shareholder of Ariston Holdings. The connection snapped into place like a bone breaking in reverse. Not fracture, but assembly. The horrible, clarifying sensation of seeing the full shape of a machine that has been operating in the dark for years. Tate, Bowman, Cross, Ariston, Meridian. A chain that ran from a caseworker's desk to a judge's bench to a corporate boardroom, and at every link in that chain, a child's life was the currency being spent. Thursday, Warden said. Everything lands on Thursday. He hung up, stood on the porch in the dark. The cold pressed against him like something with weight and intent. Through the cabin window, the fire had burned low, and Marie had fallen asleep in the chair with her book open on her chest, and Decker was still at the door, and Haven was still lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Warden went inside. He walked to Haven's room, stood in the doorway. The girl's eyes moved to him instantly. She'd heard him coming. She always heard everything coming. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to be honest about whether you can do it. Haven sat up. The quilt pooled around her waist. The cedar smell rose from the fabric. Tomorrow morning, someone's going to come here. An auditor. The woman from the courtroom. She's going to need you to remember everything, every foster home, every caseworker visit, every time something went wrong with a placement, every detail you can recall about how Denise Bowman handled your case. Haven looked at him. In the low light, her eyes were enormous. Dark mirrors that reflected the ember glow from the living room and held it. You're asking me to remember the worst 6 years of my life, on purpose, out loud, to a stranger. Yes. And if I do, it helps the other kids, the 11? If you do, it helps us stop the people who did this, not just to you, to all of them. Haven was quiet. She looked at the small window. Outside, the trees were black shapes against a blacker sky, and somewhere beyond them the city sat with its courthouses and its offices and its systems and its files and its 72-hour clocks, counting down toward a hearing that would either give her a family or feed her to a machine. I remember everything, she said. Every house, every name, every time she was supposed to come and didn't, every time a placement fell apart and she was the one who showed up after, like she was surprised, like she didn't know. Haven's voice was steady, but her hands gripped the quilt. I remember because I wrote it down. All of it. In a notebook. It's in my backpack. Warden looked at the backpack on the floor beside the bed. The same soaked, broken zippered backpack she'd carried 8 miles through a November storm. The one that held a toothbrush and 2 shirts and a pair of jeans and a composition notebook filled with handwriting no one had ever read. You wrote it down, he said. Since I was 8. Every placement, every date, every person. She looked at him. I didn't know why. I just knew that if nobody else was keeping track of me, I should keep track of myself. Warden leaned against the door frame. Something inside his chest shifted. Not cracked, not broke, but shifted, the way tectonic plates shift when pressure that has been building for millennia finally exceeds the friction holding it in place. This girl, this 12-year-old girl who had spent 6 years writing down her own destruction in a composition notebook because no one else would, who had carried the evidence of her own systematic erasure in a backpack with a broken zipper through 8 miles of freezing rain and placed it on a table in a room full of strangers and asked them to sign a piece of paper. Get some sleep, he said. His voice was rough, rougher than he intended, the roughness of a man holding something that doesn't fit in his hands and refusing to let go. Tomorrow's going to be long. Warden. He stopped. Thank you for not lying to me. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The fire crackled in the other room. Marie breathed in her sleep. The wind pressed against the cabin walls and the walls held. Nobody's going to lie to you again, he said. Not while I'm standing. He walked back to the porch, stood in the dark, watched the tree line. Somewhere on the road beyond the trees, headlights appeared, distant, moving slowly, sweeping through the darkness like eyes searching for something that didn't want to be found. The headlights stopped, held. 2 bright points in the black distance, perfectly still, aimed down the dirt track that led to the cabin. Warden reached for his phone. The headlights went dark. And in the silence that followed, broken only by the wind and the owl and the sound of his own heart hammering against the inside of his ribs like a fist pounding on a locked door, Warden McCall understood that the next 12 hours would decide everything. Not just for Haven, not just for the club, but for every child whose name was written in a file that someone with a county badge had decided to sell. Warden didn't breathe. He stood on the porch with his phone in one hand and the other hand gripping the railing so hard the wood groaned beneath his fingers, and he watched the place where the headlights had been. Darkness. Total. The kind of darkness that doesn't just mean the absence of light, but the presence of something that has chosen to hide inside it. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Nothing moved. He called Colt. The phone barely rang once. "Front porch," Warden said. "Now." Colt appeared in 4 seconds. He'd been sleeping in the chair by the door. Not sleeping. Existing in that state between consciousness and readiness that combat teaches you, where your body rests, but your nervous system stays at operating temperature. He came onto the porch with his boots already on and his jacket already zipped and his eyes already adjusted to the dark, because he'd never fully let them adjust to the light. "Tree line," Warden said. 200 yards. Headlights appeared and went dark. Colt looked. His eyes moved across the darkness with the slow, methodical sweep of a man reading terrain for threats. Left to right, ground to canopy, near to far. Could be a lost driver. Lost drivers don't kill their lights and sit. No, they don't. Decker was at the door. He'd heard them through the wall. He didn't ask questions. He stepped onto the porch and stood at the far end, covering the angle Colt and Warden couldn't see. And the three men formed a triangle of awareness that covered 360 degrees of dark November woods without exchanging another word. 5 minutes passed. The wind moved through bare branches and made sounds that could have been footsteps or could have been nothing. The owl called again. Somewhere distant, a coyote answered, a high, thin sound that rose and dissolved. Then an engine started. Not close, 200 yards, maybe more. The sound was muffled by trees and cold air, but it was unmistakable. A heavy vehicle turning over, idling for a moment, then pulling away. No headlights. The sound receded down the dirt track toward the main road, growing smaller and thinner until it merged with the general silence of the night. They'd been spotted, and whoever had spotted them had decided, for now, that approaching wasn't worth the risk. "They'll be back," Colt said. "Not tonight," Warden said. "Tonight they were scouting, confirming location. They'll report back and come with more people and better paperwork." "When?" "Before Thursday, probably tomorrow night, after dark." Warden went inside. He checked the locks. Front door, back door, the window in Haven's room that didn't latch properly and needed a wooden dowel jammed in the track to hold it closed. He jammed it, stood in the hallway outside her door and listened. Her breathing was steady. She was asleep. Actually asleep. Not the coiled, performative stillness of a child pretending to rest, but the deep, even breathing of someone whose body had finally overruled every defense mechanism and shut down. He let her sleep. Whatever tomorrow brought, sleep was the one thing he could give her tonight that no one could take back. He didn't sleep. He sat on the porch with Colt and Decker in rotating 2-hour watches and drank coffee that Marie made at midnight and 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., bringing it out without being asked, setting the mugs on the railing and going back inside without a word, because Marie McCall understood that some nights required men to sit in the dark and watch the trees, and the best thing she could do was keep them caffeinated and leave them alone. Dawn came slowly. It didn't arrive. It seeped. Gray light bleeding through the tree canopy like watercolor on wet paper, formless and cold and gradual. The world materialized around the cabin in layers. First the porch railing, then the yard, then the oaks, then the dirt track, then the road beyond. No SUV, no headlights, no footprints in the mud that didn't belong to them. At 6:47 a.m., a car came up the dirt track. Warden was on his feet before it cleared the tree line. Colt was beside him. Decker was inside between the door and Haven's room. The car was a silver Honda Civic with a dented bumper and a state government parking sticker on the windshield. Karen Aldridge got out looking like she hadn't slept either. She carried the same box of documents from the courtroom, plus a laptop bag and a thermos of coffee, and an expression that combined professional resolve with the slightly wild-eyed look of a woman who had realized sometime in the last 24 hours that her career was now inseparable from the fate of a 12-year-old girl she'd never met before yesterday. Roach had called her. Roach had explained. Roach had given her the cabin's location on the condition that she tell no one and drive a route that didn't appear on any navigation app. "Ms. Aldridge," Warden said. "Mr. McCall." She looked at the cabin, looked at the porch, looked at the two bikers standing in the gray dawn like sentries who had been carved from the same wood as the railing. "Nice place. It keeps the rain off. I need to speak with Haven. She's asleep. Then I'll wait." She didn't have to wait long. Haven appeared in the doorway at 7:15, wearing Marie's sweater and the wool socks and holding a mug of coffee that Decker had made too strong and too hot, which was apparently the only way anyone in this organization made coffee. She looked at Aldridge. She looked at the box of documents. She looked at the laptop. "You're the auditor," Haven said. "Karen. Just Karen." "Karen." Haven sat down on the porch step. She set her coffee beside her and pulled her backpack onto her lap and unzipped it and removed the composition notebook. Battered, water-stained, its cover curled from last night's rain, but its pages intact, dense with handwriting that was small and precise and filled every line from margin to margin. "I've been writing in this since I was 8, Haven said. She held it out. Aldridge took it, opened it to the first page. Read. Her face went through a transformation that happened so slowly it was almost invisible. The professional composure dissolving, molecule by molecule, as her eyes moved across pages filled with dates and names and details that a child should never have needed to record, because adults should have been recording them instead. November 3rd. Denise didn't come for the home check. Third time. Called her office. They said she was in a meeting. The Whelans said if she doesn't come by Friday, they're sending me back. December 19th. Moved to Darla's house. Nobody told me until the morning. Denise said the Whelans weren't a good fit. The Whelans told me Denise never returned their calls about the support services they requested. March 7th. Darla drinks every morning now. I told Denise. Denise said she would look into it. She didn't look into it. Page after page. 4 years of documentation. Dates, names, conversations recorded with the precision of someone who understood, even at 8 years old, that her own memory was the only system that was keeping track of her existence. Aldridge read for 45 minutes. Nobody interrupted her. Warden stood on the porch. Marie made breakfast in the kitchen. Eggs and toast. Simple. Warm. Decker sat with Haven and didn't speak because by now they had developed the particular silence of two people who had survived the same machine and found that silence was more honest than most words. When Aldridge looked up, her eyes were red. "Haven," she said, "I need to take this notebook. I need to photograph every page and enter it into evidence. It corroborates 11 of the 13 data points I identified in Bowman's pattern. Dates match. Placement failures match. Gaps in mandated services match." She paused. Her hands were shaking, not dramatically, just the fine tremor of someone who has spent 20 years auditing government systems and has just encountered something that makes every previous audit feel like proofreading. "This is the most important piece of evidence I've ever held." "You can photograph it," Haven said, "but I want it back." "Of course. It's the only thing I own that's mine." Aldridge photographed every page. 97 pages, 4 years of a child's life rendered in careful handwriting on ruled paper. When she finished, she made phone calls. To her office, to a judge she trusted, to a federal contact at the Department of Justice who specialized in institutional fraud. Each call was short, clipped, professional. Each call ended with the same sentence. "I'm filing for an emergency preservation order against Ariston Holdings. I need it signed today." By 11 a.m., the order was signed. A federal judge in the state capitol authorized the immediate seizure and preservation of Ariston Holdings' corporate records across all 9 states. The order was transmitted to federal marshals, real ones this time, operating under genuine authority, who arrived at Ariston's corporate offices at 11:47 a.m. and seized 6 servers, 14 filing cabinets, and a personal laptop belonging to Victor Lassiter that contained, among other things, a spreadsheet tracking revenue projections based on projected child intake numbers for the next fiscal year. Children. Reduced to projected intake numbers. Revenue line items in a spreadsheet maintained by a man who had never visited a single one of the 17 facilities that bore his company's name. At 2:30 p.m., Roach called Warden. "Tate's been picked up," he said. "Federal agents, downtown. He was trying to board a bus to Philadelphia using a fake ID he apparently bought 2 hours ago. The fake ID was terrible. The photo didn't even look like him." "Bowman?" "Turned herself in this morning. Walked into the DA's office with a lawyer and started talking. She's cooperating, naming names. She gave them Cross, the judge, and 2 other caseworkers in neighboring counties who were running the same playbook." Warden leaned against the porch railing. The afternoon light was pale and cold, and it fell across the yard in long shadows that stretched from the oaks like reaching fingers. "It's falling apart," Roach said. "The whole network. Aldridge's preservation order hit Ariston's servers this morning, and their legal team is already trying to negotiate. They know what's on those drives." Thursday's hearing? Still on, but the landscape's changed. Tate's in custody. Bowman's cooperating. Cross has been removed from the bench pending investigation. The state's opposition to our petition is, as Delgado put it, functionally decapitated. For the first time in 48 hours, Warden exhaled. Not a sigh, not a breath of relief, just an exhale. The physical release of air that had been held in his lungs by tension and fear, and the sustained, grinding effort of holding a broken world together long enough for someone to fix it. "We're coming home," he said. They drove back to the city in the late afternoon. The same truck, the same back roads. But the quality of the drive was different, slower, quieter. The urgency replaced by something that felt like the silence after a storm passes. When the rain stops and the wind dies and the world sits in the wet, exhausted stillness of having survived something. Haven sat in the back seat. She didn't look out the window. She looked at her hands. Marie's sweater sleeves still covered her fingers, and she pushed them back and studied her own hands, small, scarred on the left palm from the chain-link fence she'd climbed 2 nights ago, nails bitten to the quick from years of anxiety she'd never named. These hands had carried a backpack 8 miles. These hands had held a coffee mug in a room full of strangers. These hands had placed a guardianship form on a table and asked the most terrifying question of her life. These hands had written 97 pages in a composition notebook that was now the cornerstone of a federal investigation. She turned them over, studied the lines, closed them into fists, opened them. Marie, in the front seat, watched her through the rearview mirror and said nothing. Thursday morning arrived the way all endings arrive, without ceremony. The Ridgeton County Family Courthouse looked the same as it had 2 days ago. Same gray stone, same marble steps, same tall windows. But the steps were empty now. No marshals, no Denise Bowman, no Gerald Tate with his county badge and his expensive suit. Just stone and cold air and the faint sound of the city waking up around it. 30 motorcycles pulled up at 8:37 a.m. The sound rolled through the streets and bounced off buildings and drew faces to windows. And Haven, sitting in the van with Delgado, watched the column arrive and felt something she'd been trying not to feel for 2 days because feeling it meant risking it, and risking it meant the possibility of losing it. She felt it anyway. They walked up the steps together. Same formation, same boots on marble, same creak of leather. But the walk was different this time. Less urgent, less desperate, more like a procession than an advance, the measured pace of men who had already fought the battle and were now walking to the place where the outcome would be spoken aloud. Courtroom 3. B. Judge Sarah Hawk entered at 9:02 a.m. She looked at the gallery. 30 men, same as before. She looked at the state's table. Prentice was there, but alone now. No Tate, no Bowman, no support, just a single attorney with a folder that looked thinner than it had on Tuesday. "Mr. Delgado," Judge Hawk said, "is your petition still before this court?" "It is, Your Honor." "Ms. Prentice, does the state wish to maintain its objection?" Prentice stood. She was a professional. She'd been hired to argue a position, and the position had collapsed beneath her, and what remained was the specific dignity of an attorney who knows when to stop fighting and start acknowledging. Your Honor, in light of the ongoing federal investigation into the county's Child Protective Division and the arrest of Deputy Director Gerald Tate, the state is withdrawing its objection to the guardianship petition. She paused, swallowed. The state further acknowledges that the minor's welfare was compromised by systemic failures within the department and that the petitioners have demonstrated a commitment to the child's safety that the state at this time cannot match. The words hung in the courtroom. They hung there the way a white flag hangs, visible, unmistakable, carrying the weight of everything that came before it. Judge Hawk nodded. She opened the petition, read it one more time, turned to Haven. Haven, I need to ask you one final time, for the record. Is it your wish to be placed in the guardianship of the Storm Riders Community Alliance? Haven stood. The chair didn't scrape this time. She pushed it back gently, stood straight, and looked at the judge with the same dark, steady eyes that had looked at her 2 days ago from the witness stand. Yes, she said. Do you understand that this arrangement is conditional? That there will be regular welfare checks, educational requirements, and court reviews? Yes. Do you have anything else you'd like to say to the court? Haven turned and looked at the gallery. 30 men looked back. Warden in the front row, his hands on his knees, his concrete eyes holding steady. Colt beside him, jaw locked, nodding once. Roach leaning back with his arms crossed, and the unlit cigarette behind his ear, and an expression that might have been the closest thing to approval his face had ever produced. Decker at the end of the row, the scar across his eyebrow catching the light, his eyes wet with something he was not hiding. Grease with his massive forearms folded and his chin tucked. Nails. The man with the Vietnam tattoo. All of them. Behind them, in the last row, Marie McCall sat with her hands clasped in her lap and tears running silently down her face with the absolute lack of self-consciousness of a woman who had decided long ago that if she was going to cry, she was going to do it without apology. I'd like to say thank you, Haven said. But not to the court. She turned back to the gallery. She looked at Warden. You signed a piece of paper, she said. I know that sounds small, but nobody ever signed anything for me before that wasn't sending me somewhere else. You signed something that said, I'll take her, and then 29 other people signed the same thing. Her voice was steady, impossibly steady for 12. Steady the way a bridge is steady, engineered to hold weight, designed to carry loads, built from materials that had been tested to their breaking point and survived. I don't know how to be someone's kid. I've never been someone's kid. I've been a file number and a case note and a problem on someone's desk. So I'm probably going to be bad at this. I'm going to be quiet when you want me to talk and awake when you want me to sleep, and I'm going to check the exits in every room I enter for probably the rest of my life. She paused, breathed. But I'm going to try, because you tried first. The courtroom was silent. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a car honked. The building's heating system hummed. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds, the sounds of a world that keeps operating even when something inside it is changing. Judge Hawk picked up her gavel. This time she didn't hesitate. This court grants full community guardianship of Haven Morelli to the Storm Riders Community Alliance, with Trace McCall designated as primary custodial guardian and Marie McCall as co-guardian of residents. Conditional terms as outlined in the petition, review hearing in 90 days. She brought the gavel down. The sound was sharp and clean and final. This court is adjourned. The sound that came from the gallery was not a cheer. It was something lower, something rougher, something that started in 30 chests simultaneously and came out as a collective exhale that carried the accumulated tension of 72 hours and released it into the courtroom air like pressure escaping a valve. Men stood, hands gripped other hands, shoulders collided. Someone laughed, a short, sharp, disbelieving sound that broke and reformed into something closer to a sob. Warden stood. He didn't move toward Haven. He waited, because he understood, the way he understood engine timing and threat assessment and the specific gravity of other people's damage, that this moment belonged to her, that she needed to be the one who crossed the distance, that the choice had to be hers, The way the walk through the rain had been hers. The way the words in the courtroom had been hers. The way every step of this impossible, freezing, terrifying journey had been taken by a 12-year-old girl who had spent her entire life being moved by other people and who needed now to move herself. Haven walked down the aisle between the gallery benches. Her sneakers, the same soaked sneakers from Tuesday night, dried now, but permanently stained with rain and road, and the 8 miles between hopelessness and a garage door made soft sounds on the courtroom floor. She stopped in front of Warden. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. 6'2" and 81 pounds, scarred leather and a too big sweater, concrete eyes and dark ones. 2 people standing in a courtroom built for endings, having just witnessed a beginning. "Now what?" Haven said. "Now we go home," Warden said. Haven nodded. She reached out and took his hand the way she'd taken it the day before, her small fingers disappearing inside his grip. But this time, she didn't just hold on. She squeezed. Once. Brief. The pressure of someone who is learning, for the first time, that reaching for another person doesn't always mean falling. They walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was full. Bikers, civilians, Marge Kessler from the diner crying into a napkin, Paulie Orta blowing his nose, Cora Blanchard standing ramrod straight with her reading glasses on, and her jaw set and tears streaming down her face without her acknowledging them. Aldridge was there too, standing near the wall with her box of documents and her phone pressed to her ear, already coordinating the next phase of the investigation that Haven's notebook had ignited. Outside, the November air was cold and clean. The storm was gone. The sky was high and pale and empty, the kind of sky that appears after days of weather, scrubbed raw by wind, too tired to produce anything but light. 30 motorcycles waited at the curb. Warden mounted his Harley. Marie climbed on behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her cheek against his leather cut the way she'd done 1,000 times on 1,000 rides. And the gesture was so practiced, so ordinary, so completely devoid of performance that Haven, watching from the sidewalk, felt that nameless, warm thing beneath her ribs expand another fraction of an inch. "You're riding with Decker," Warden said. "That okay?" Haven looked at Decker. He was sitting on his Harley with a helmet in each hand. One for him, one size smaller, borrowed from someone, the chin strap adjusted to fit a 12-year-old head. He didn't say anything. He just held out the helmet the way he'd held out the plate of burned toast. Imperfect, sincere, offered without conditions. Haven took the helmet, put it on. The weight of it surprised her, heavier than she expected, pressing against her skull with a solidity that felt like protection rather than confinement. She climbed onto the back of Decker's Harley, and her feet didn't reach the pegs, but that didn't matter because Decker showed her where to put her hands, and she gripped the back of his jacket, and the leather was warm from his body heat, and the engine vibrated through the seat into her bones. "Hold on," Decker said. "I know." 30 engines fired. The sound was the same volcanic declaration it had been Tuesday morning. Pistons and exhaust, and the collective refusal of damaged men to accept the world's verdict on their worth. But this time the sound carried something else. Not urgency, not desperation. Something that sounded like the mechanical equivalent of an exhale, like the engines themselves were releasing something they'd been holding. The column rolled through Ridgeton. Same streets. Same formation. But the city looked different through Haven's visor. The buildings brighter, the faces of pedestrians more distinct, the world sharper and more detailed and more present, the way the world looks when you stop watching it through the window of a state car and start seeing it from the back of a motorcycle surrounded by people who chose you. They didn't go to the clubhouse. They went to Marge Kessler's diner. The diner sat on the corner of 5th and Rowan, a squat brick building with a neon sign that said Marge's in letters that buzzed and flickered and had been buzzing and flickering for 30 years. Inside, the booths were red vinyl, and the counter was Formica, and the coffee was terrible in exactly the way that diner coffee is supposed to be terrible. Too hot, too bitter, and absolutely irreplaceable. Marge had opened early. She'd set up the long table in the back, the one reserved for parties and holidays, and the rare occasions when all 30 storm riders showed up at once. The table was set. Coffee was ready. Plates of food were emerging from the kitchen. Eggs, bacon, toast, pancakes, hash browns, the full architecture of an American breakfast served without restraint or portion control, because Marge Kessler had been feeding these men for 15 years, and she knew that the best way to tell someone they mattered was to put more food in front of them than they could possibly eat. Haven sat at the table, between Warden and Marie, across from Decker, surrounded by 30 men who were too loud and too large, and who ate with the graceless enthusiasm of people who had been running on adrenaline and coffee for 3 days and had finally been given permission to stop. Someone told a joke. Someone else laughed too loud. Colt knocked over a glass of orange juice and grease caught it before it hit the table, and Nails said something that made Roach almost light the cigarette behind his ear before Marge shouted from the counter that if he lit that thing inside her diner, she would end him, and the whole table erupted in the kind of laughter that isn't really about what's funny, but about the fact that laughing is possible. That after everything, after the storm and the courthouse and the marshals and the black SUV and the nights on the porch watching the tree line, the human capacity for laughter had survived intact. Haven didn't laugh. Not yet. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of terrible coffee and watched the chaos around her with the careful, cataloging attention she'd applied to every environment she'd ever entered. But something was different in the way she watched. The exits were still noted, the threats were still assessed, but beneath the assessment, beneath the calibration, beneath the 12 years of survival mechanics that ran constantly in the background of her consciousness, like an operating system she couldn't shut down, something new was running. Not trust. Not yet. Trust would take years. Years of Warden being Warden, years of Marie being Marie, years of Decker sitting 3 feet away and saying nothing and being present. Years of burned toast and terrible coffee and the sound of 30 engines outside every school event and parent-teacher conference and birthday and bad day and good day and ordinary day. Trust would be built the way the cabin was built, board by board, nail by nail, slow and deliberate and subject to weather. But something before trust, the precursor, the foundation on which trust would eventually be constructed, if the materials held and the builders showed up, and the storms didn't tear it down faster than it could be repaired. Belonging. The word arrived in her mind without announcement. It simply appeared, like a light turning on in a room she didn't know she had. Belonging. The sensation of being inside a space that had been made for you, or that had made room for you, or that had looked at you and decided that making room was worth the effort. Marie's hand landed on her shoulder, brief, light. The weight of a sparrow landing and leaving. Haven didn't flinch. She noted this with a private, astonished clarity. She didn't flinch. For the first time in years, an adult touched her without warning, and her body didn't react as if it had been struck. "Eat your breakfast," Marie said. Haven ate. The diner filled with morning light. It came through the windows in long, warm bands that fell across the table and turned the coffee mugs to gold and caught the dust in the air and made it visible, tiny particles floating in the light like evidence of all the invisible things that are always present but only become visible when the angle is right. Outside, 30 Harleys lined the curb. Chrome caught the sun. Engines cooled with the ticking sound of hot metal contracting in cold air. The neon sign buzzed. A woman walked past on the sidewalk and stopped and looked at the motorcycles and looked through the window at the table full of bikers and the girl sitting among them and walked on, shaking her head, smiling at something she didn't understand but recognized. At the table, Warden drank his coffee. Marie ate her eggs. Decker read the back of a syrup bottle because Decker read everything within arm's reach when he was nervous, and being happy made him nervous because happiness was a state he'd had less practice with than danger. Roach sat at the end of the table with his arms crossed and his unlit cigarette behind his ear and watched the room with the quiet, grudging satisfaction of a man who had been right about the risks and wrong about whether the risks were worth taking, and who was, for once in his life, grateful to be wrong. Colt leaned across the table toward Haven. "Hey, kid." Haven looked at him. "Welcome home." The words were simple. 2 words, in fact, that contained nothing profound and everything necessary. Welcome home. Spoken in a diner on a Thursday morning by a man with a criminal record and a leather jacket and scars on his hands and absolutely zero qualification to raise a child except the single most important one. He had chosen to. Haven looked at her coffee, looked at the table, looked at the 30 men and one woman who surrounded her in a booth in a diner in a city that had tried to erase her and failed. "Thanks," she said, and she drank her coffee. And outside the neon buzzed and the engines ticked, and the November air moved through the streets of Ridgeton carrying the sound of something that might have been an ending but felt, for the first time in Haven Morelli's 12 years on this earth, like the beginning of something she didn't have to survive alone. 6 years later, on a warm Saturday in June, Haven Morelli stood behind a podium on the steps of the Ridgeton County Courthouse, the same steps she'd walked up in a too-big sweater with 30 bikers around her, and addressed a crowd of 400 people at the first annual Guardians Ride charity event. She was 18. She was an honor student. She had been accepted to the State University's pre-law program on a full scholarship, and in her application essay she had written 11 pages about a composition notebook and the woman who taught her that keeping records was the first act of resistance against a system designed to make you disappear. Behind her, on those marble steps, stood 30 men in leather, older now, grayer. Warden's beard was almost white. Roach had finally lit the cigarette, once at Haven's high school graduation, in the parking lot, where he smoked half of it and put it out and put it back behind his ear and never lit it again. Decker had a daughter of his own now, a 2-year-old named Rebecca who called Haven Auntie and pulled on Grease's beard at Sunday dinners and was growing up in a world where the word family meant exactly what the people in it decided it meant. Marie stood beside Warden. Her hand was in his. Her hair was fully gray now, and she wore it down, and it caught the June light, and she looked at Haven the way she had looked at her from the first morning in the cabin, with the steady, unsentimental, absolute love of a woman who had been given a second chance at life by a nurse in a hospital bathroom and had spent 12 years repaying it by raising that nurse's daughter. In the crowd, Aldridge stood near the back. The investigation she had sparked with a box of documents in a courtroom had resulted in the shutdown of all 17 Ariston Holdings facilities, the indictment of 14 county officials across 9 states, and the recovery and replacement of 231 children who had been systematically funneled into a for-profit machine. Gerald Tate was serving 12 years. Denise Bowman had served 3 and was released and had disappeared into a life that didn't include her name on any child's file ever again. Judge Raymond Cross had been disbarred. Victor Lassiter had never been found. Haven looked at the crowd, families, children, social workers who had come to learn, legislators who had come to listen, bikers from 12 different clubs who had ridden from 5 different states to stand on a street in Ridgeton and rev their engines for kids who needed to hear what a wall sounded like. She leaned into the microphone. "When I was 12 years old," she said, "I stole a form from a clerk's desk and walked 8 miles in the rain to ask a room full of strangers to be my family." She looked at Warden. He looked back. Concrete eyes, wet. He didn't wipe them. He never did. They said yes, and they never stopped saying it. Behind her 30 engines fired. The sound rolled through the streets of Ridgeton like a promise kept, like a debt repaid, like the mechanical heartbeat of a family built from broken parts that held together not because they were perfect, but because they chose to. Haven smiled. The Harleys thundered, and somewhere in the sound, beneath the exhaust and the chrome and the leather and the scars and the years, was the echo of a 6-year-old memory whispered in a parked car by a woman who knew she was disappearing. "Find the storm riders. They won't turn you away." They didn't.